Thomas Caldwell looked at her the way a man looks at something he ordered and wants to return. He stood at the edge of the station platform in Clearwater, Montana, arms crossed over his chest, hat pulled low against the afternoon glare, and when Amelia stepped down from the stagecoach with a worn leather bag in one hand and two small girls pressed against her sides, his face didn't just fall, it shut, like a door being bolted from the inside. "You didn't say anything about children," he said. Not quiet, not pulled aside. Right there on the platform, with half the town watching. Amelia's oldest, Lily, tightened her grip on her mother's hand. She was 5 years old and already understood that something was wrong. "I wrote to you about my daughters," Amelia said carefully. "In my second letter." "I don't recall that letter." "I have a copy." "That doesn't matter now, does it?" It wasn't a question. He looked at the girls again. Emma, barely 4, had her face turned into her mother's skirt. And then he looked at Amelia's dress, the hem frayed at the ankle, the left boot with a crack along the sole that she'd tried to seal with pine tar. He took in the whole picture of her in about 4 seconds, and whatever warm language he'd put into those letters for 8 months, whatever promises he'd made about a safe home and a good life and a fresh start, all of it disappeared from his face like smoke in wind. "I was expecting a woman who could bring something to this arrangement," he said. "Resources, standing, some kind of, He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't make him sound as bad as he was. "Foundation." "I brought myself," Amelia said, "and my daughters." That's exactly the problem. The people on the platform weren't even pretending not to listen anymore. A woman near the feed store doorway had stopped sweeping entirely. 2 men by the water trough stood with their heads angled just slightly in the direction of the confrontation. A boy of about 12 sat on a barrel eating an apple and staring with open curiosity. Amelia did not look at any of them. She kept her eyes on Thomas Caldwell because she'd learned a long time ago that when someone is humiliating you in public, the worst thing you can do is look around for an audience. You hand them the satisfaction, and you never get it back. "I cannot take on a woman with 2 children and no means," Thomas said. "That's not what I advertised for. I need a partner, not a—" He stopped again. "Not a what?" Amelia asked quietly. He had enough sense not to finish that sentence, but the pause said everything it needed to say. She stood there for a moment, just stood there, with Lily's hand in her right hand and Emma's in her left, and she did something Thomas Caldwell clearly hadn't expected. She nodded. One slow, controlled nod, like she was confirming something she'd already suspected, like she was filing his behavior away in a place inside herself where she kept things she would need to remember later. "All right," she said. That was all. She picked up her bag, adjusted Emma's weight slightly against her hip, and walked away from him down the length of the platform toward the street, and she did not look back once. She had $14.32. She knew the exact amount because she'd counted it 3 times on the stagecoach, once outside of Billings, once when they crossed the river, and once when the driver called out Clearwater ahead, and she felt something cold move through her chest that she refused to name as fear. $14.32, a bag with 2 changes of clothes for each of the girls, one good dress she'd been saving for meeting Thomas Caldwell, and a tin box with the letters, all of them tied with a piece of string. 8 months of correspondence that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft along the folds. She had been a fool. She knew that now, walking down the main street of Clearwater without any idea where she was going. Not a complete fool. She'd been careful, she'd asked the right questions. She'd written honest letters and received letters that sounded honest in return. But she had wanted so badly for the thing to work that she had taken the wanting for evidence. That was the fool part. The wanting. Emma was quiet, which was unusual for Emma, who was generally the loudest person in any room she occupied regardless of her size. She had both arms around her mother's neck and her chin on Amelia's shoulder, and she was watching the town go by with the serious expression she only got when she understood that something was wrong but couldn't find the shape of it. Lily walked beside them with her small jaw set and her eyes forward. She was her father's daughter in that way. James had always walked like that when things went bad, steady and deliberate, like if you kept your feet moving in the right direction, the rest would sort itself eventually. James had been dead for 2 years. He'd gone to work one morning at the rail yard and he had not come back, and the company had sent a man in a good suit to say how sorry they were and give Amelia a sum of money that had seemed significant until she started trying to live on it in a city that charged twice what things were worth, because it could. The money lasted 14 months. Then she had answered an advertisement in a newspaper she'd found left on a park bench, because she couldn't afford her own copy. Thomas Caldwell, 41, cattle rancher, established homestead, Clearwater, Montana territory. Seeks a capable woman of good character for partnership in the work of building a life on the frontier. Experience with household management preferred. Children considered. Children considered. She had underlined those two words. She had sat on the edge of the bed in the room she was renting by the week, with Lily and Emma asleep beside her, and she had read those two words and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for so long she'd stopped noticing it. She had written him a careful letter. She had told him about herself honestly, her age, her background, her situation, her daughters. She had not made herself sound better than she was, and she had not made her circumstances sound worse. She had told him about James and the rail yard and the money running out, and she had told him that she was not a woman who needed saving, that she was a woman who needed a fair chance and was willing to work for it. His first letter back had said, "I appreciate your honesty. Most people who answer these advertisements spend more time describing what they want than what they can offer. You described yourself. That tells me something." She had read that letter so many times. Now she stood on the main street of a town she didn't know with $14.32 and 2 children and nowhere to go, and somewhere behind her, Thomas Caldwell was probably already back at his ranch, relieved to have gotten out of a bad situation early, and she was the bad situation. She found the general store and went inside. Not to buy anything. She couldn't afford to spend money on things that weren't necessary. But because she needed to sit down for a moment and she needed the girls out of the sun. The woman behind the counter was maybe 60, with gray hair pinned up under a cotton cap and the kind of face that had been through enough that it didn't arrange itself into expressions very quickly. "Help you with something?" she asked. "I need to find work," Amelia said, "and somewhere to sleep tonight. My daughters and I just came in on the stage." The woman looked at Lily, who looked back at her steadily. Then she looked at Emma, who had transferred from Amelia's hip to the floor and was examining the jars of penny candy on the low shelf with the focused attention of a scientist. "Emma," Amelia said quietly, "don't touch." Emma put her hands behind her back without looking up. The woman behind the counter, her name was Ruth Alderman, Amelia would learn later. She'd owned this store for 19 years and had seen everything the frontier could produce in the way of human difficulty. Studied Amelia for a moment without speaking. "You're the one Thomas Caldwell was expecting," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I heard about what happened at the station." The way she said it was careful, not unkind, not pitying, just careful. "Half the town heard. Tom Caldwell's got a voice that carries when he wants it to." "Apparently." Ruth Alderman looked at her for another moment. Then she reached under the counter and produced a tin cup and poured coffee from the pot on the stove behind her without being asked. She set it on the counter in front of Amelia. "Town's got a boarding house on the east side," she said. "Mrs. Pollard runs it. She's not cheap and she's not what you'd call warm, but she's clean and she won't turn away children." She paused. "I talked to her today before dark. The decent rooms go fast." "Thank you," Amelia said. She drank the coffee standing at the counter. It was strong and slightly burnt and the best thing she'd tasted in 3 days of stagecoach travel. Emma had picked up a wooden spool from a basket near the floor and was examining it with great seriousness. "Emma," Lily said, "put it back." Emma put it back. Mrs. Pollard's boarding house had a room available. It was on the 3rd floor, small, with a window that faced the alley and a bed that was a tight fit for 2 adults, but could reasonably hold a woman and 2 small children if nobody moved around much in the night. The price was 40 cents a night. Amelia did the arithmetic. $14.32. 40 cents a night. That was 35 nights before she had nothing. She paid for 1 week. She got the girls washed up in the basin at the end of the hall and fed them the last of the bread she'd packed from the last town. And she sat in the wooden chair by the window and watched the sun go down over Clearwater, Montana, and tried to be honest with herself about her situation. She was in a town where she knew no one. She had 30 cents left after the week's rent. She'd miscounted, she thought, or there'd been more expenses on the road than she'd tracked properly. She had no connections, no references that meant anything out here, and no plan except the plan that had just collapsed on a train platform in front of an audience. She was not going to cry about Thomas Caldwell. She had made herself that promise somewhere around the feed store, and she was going to keep it because once you started crying about the wrong people, you couldn't always stop. What she needed was work. Any work, quickly, and then better work once she'd established herself. She could cook, she could sew, she could manage household accounts. She'd done it for herself and James and then for herself alone. And anyone who could keep a family housed and fed on a rail worker's wage and then on a dwindling insurance settlement had accounting skills that were worth something. She could read, and she wrote clearly, and she was not afraid of difficulty because difficulty had been her companion for 2 years, and she'd learned its rhythms. She had to find someone who needed those things. Tomorrow. First thing. Lily was already asleep, curled on her side with her knees pulled up, her dark hair spread over the pillow. Emma had fought sleep for a while, the way she always did, protesting against unconsciousness, as though she didn't trust the world not to do something interesting without her. But she'd gone under eventually, one small fist curled against her chin. Amelia looked at them for a long moment. Then she took out the tin box and the string-wrapped letters, and she held them in her lap without opening them. She didn't need to open them. She knew what they said. She'd been carrying them for 8 months like a map that turned out to lead somewhere that didn't exist. She put them back in the box. She put the box back in the bag. She went to sleep. The next morning, she was at the general store when Ruth Alderman opened it. She had left the girls with Mrs. Pollard, which involved a negotiation that cost her another 15 cents, and her assurance that the girls were well behaved, which was true for Lily and approximately 60% true for Emma. But she couldn't walk the town asking after work with 2 children in tow, and she had no other options, so she paid the 15 cents. "Back again," Ruth said without surprise. "I'm looking for work. I thought you might know who needs what." Ruth Alderman didn't answer immediately. She was unpacking a crate of canned goods, and she kept at it while she thought, stacking tins on the shelf with practiced efficiency. "The Miller family lost their housekeeper 3 weeks ago," she said finally. "Ellen Miller's been managing herself, and she's not happy about it. They're on the North Road, about 2 miles. Anyone else?" "Doc Hennessy sometimes takes on someone to help with his office. Filing, mostly. He's particular about his records." She set down a tin. "And there's the Blackridge place, but I don't know about that one." "Why not?" Ruth considered this. "Ethan Blackridge is a decent man. Ranch went through hard times after his wife died 3 years back. Place needs work. He needs help, but people talk. And a single woman out there alone." She shook her head. "People in this town are already talking about you. Thomas Caldwell's not someone who keeps his opinions quiet." "What is he saying?" "That you misrepresented yourself in your letters. That you tried to trap a man into taking on a widow and her debts." Amelia stood very still. "I didn't misrepresent anything. I told him everything in my letters. I have the copies." "I believe you," Ruth said simply. "Doesn't change what he's saying." Amelia thought about the copies in the tin box. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that she had kept them for a reason that maybe she hadn't fully understood at the time. You keep things like that when some part of you doesn't quite believe the story you're being told. Some part of her had been writing careful letters and keeping careful copies because some part of her had known, even before she arrived, that she might need proof. "I'll try the Miller place first," she said, "and the doctor." She spent the morning covering ground. The Miller house was 2 miles on a rutted road that the August heat had baked into something close to ceramic, and she walked it in her cracked boots and arrived to find Ellen Miller, a thin woman of about 45 with the air of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks, standing in her kitchen, looking at a pile of mending like it had personally offended her. Ellen Miller hired her on the spot for 3 days a week, cooking, mending, household management, and offered her 75 cents a day. It wasn't enough to live on, not with the boarding house and the girls to feed, but it was a start. And it was immediate, and Amelia shook her hand and said she'd begin Thursday. Doc Hennessy's office was in the center of town, a converted storefront with a hand-lettered sign above the door. He was a compact man in his 50s with white hair and reading spectacles, and the particular patience of someone who spent his days with people in pain. He looked at Amelia over his spectacles for a moment when she explained what she could offer, then said he needed someone 2 mornings a week to handle correspondence and filing, for which he would pay 50 cents per morning. She walked back to Mrs. Pollard's boarding house with $1.25 coming per week, and the knowledge that this was not enough and would have to become more. But it was more than nothing. She had started with nothing, and she had worked herself to more than nothing before. The storm came in the 3rd day. She'd been working at the Miller house when the sky changed. The light went yellow-green, and the air got that thick, pressured quality that she'd felt once before, years ago, in Illinois, before a tornado had taken out 3 houses on the next block. She'd gathered Lily and Emma from Mrs. Pollard's and tried to get back to the boarding house before it broke, but she'd miscalculated the speed of it, or maybe the storm had moved faster than weather had any right to. It hit 3/4 of a mile outside of town. Rain came sideways. The road dissolved. Lily was clutching her hand and Emma was crying. Not the performance crying she sometimes deployed to get what she wanted, but the real kind. The kind Amelia had only heard a few times, and each time it had meant that Emma was genuinely frightened. Emma was not a child who frightened easily. She got them off the road. She didn't know whose land it was, couldn't see much of anything through the rain, but there was a structure ahead, dark and solid, and she ran for it, and it turned out to be a barn, old, with the smell of hay and horses, and the particular damp wood smell of a building that had seen many seasons. The door was unlocked, and she pulled it open and got the girls inside and pulled it shut behind them and stood in the dimness listening to the rain hammer the roof like it was trying to get through. She got them settled in the hay. She stripped off her own coat and wrapped it around them. She found a dry corner and pulled them against her and held them and waited. Emma cried for another few minutes, then quieted. Lily didn't cry at all. Lily's response to fear was to go very still and very watchful, which was sometimes harder to witness than tears. "Are we safe?" Lily asked. "Yes," Amelia said. She meant it. The barn was solid. The storm was violent, but it wasn't a tornado. They were out of the rain and off the road, and she could feel the structure holding around them. "We're safe." "Where are we?" "I don't know exactly. Someone's barn." Lily considered this. "Will they be angry?" "I don't think a reasonable person would be angry about this," Amelia said, "but I suppose we'll find out." She didn't hear the barn door open over the noise of the storm. The first she knew of him was the lantern light, swinging slightly as he came through the door from the far end of the barn, and she instinctively pulled the girls closer and stood up. He stopped when he saw them. He was tall, not imposingly so, but noticeably, with dark hair that the rain had plastered against his forehead, and the kind of face that showed every year of whatever difficulty it had been through without apologizing for any of it. He was maybe 38, maybe 40. He was carrying the lantern in one hand and had what looked like a rope coiled over his other shoulder, and he was thoroughly soaked. He looked at Amelia, then at the girls, then back at Amelia. "I heard the door," he said. His voice was level, not angry, just a man stating a fact. "I'm sorry," Amelia said. "We were caught in the storm. I didn't know whose property this was. We needed shelter." He stood there for a moment in the lantern light. He looked at the girls again. Emma, who had stopped crying and was now staring at him with enormous eyes, and Lily, who had positioned herself slightly in front of Emma in a gesture that was so adult and so unconscious that it made something tighten in the chest without warning. "You're from town," he said. "I've seen you before. Yesterday, coming out of Alderman's." "Yes." "You're the woman Thomas Caldwell was supposed to marry." There it was. Even out here on somebody's remote ranch in the middle of a storm, it had gotten there before her. She felt the now familiar combination of exhaustion and controlled anger that had become the background feeling of the last 3 days. "I'm Amelia Whitaker," she said. "These are my daughters, Lily and Emma." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Come inside. The house is better shelter than this." "We don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," he said. "You're wet and your children are cold. Come inside." He said it plainly, without ceremony, the way you'd say something that was simply true and required no additional explanation. She hesitated for one more second, then she picked up her bag and took Lily's hand and followed him through the rain toward the house. His name was Ethan Blackridge. He had a fire going and he built it up without fuss while Amelia got the girls out of their wet things. He found blankets, rough wool, practical, warm, and a clean shirt that Lily swam in but that wrapped around both girls together reasonably well. He had food on the stove, something with venison and root vegetables, and he served it without asking whether they wanted it, which was the right instinct because Amelia had too much pride to ask for food, and the girls were hungry enough that pride was an abstraction they couldn't afford. Emma ate 2 bowls and fell asleep sitting up, which was a thing she did when she was truly exhausted. Lily ate carefully and watched Ethan Blackridge the way she watched everything she wasn't sure about yet. Ethan ate at the other end of the table and didn't try to make conversation, which Amelia appreciated more than she could say. She was tired in a way that went past the body. She was tired in the way that comes from holding things together for a long time with no slack in the line and no one on the other end. He cleared the dishes. He was competent at it, which told her something. This was not a man who had staff to manage the ordinary business of a house. He'd been doing it himself. She looked around the kitchen properly for the first time. It was functional but neglected in the specific way of a house where someone is maintaining the essentials and letting everything else slide. Practical things were cared for. The stove was clean, the tools were in order, but there was no warmth. The curtains at the windows were plain and unadorned. There were no rugs on the floor, the wooden surfaces were clean, but had the gray, unloved look of things that nobody polished. It was a house that had forgotten what it was supposed to feel like. "I'll be out of your way when the storm passes," she said. "Storm's going to run through the night," he said. He said it like a man reporting the weather, not making a calculation. "There's a room upstairs, take it." "I can't accept. You're not going back to town tonight in this, not with children." He looked at her, and there was nothing in his expression that she could read as pity or condescension or anything she needed to deflect. He was just talking. "Take the room. Tomorrow, if you want to leave, leave." She looked at Lily. Lily was falling asleep against the wall, still upright, with Emma's head on her shoulder. "Thank you," Amelia said. She meant it differently than she had meant it with Ruth Alderman's coffee. This was harder to say, and she felt the weight of it. Ethan Blackridge nodded once. Rooms at the top of the stairs, blankets in the chest. He carried Emma upstairs for her without asking, because Emma was deeply asleep and would have been dead weight. And he did it with an ease that suggested he was a man who understood the practical logistics of unconscious children. He set her on the bed and straightened up and looked at Emma for a moment with an expression that came and went too quickly to read. "She always sleep like that?" he asked. "Like what?" "Like nothing could touch her." Amelia looked at her daughter. The small fist, the total surrender of it, the way Emma slept like sleep was something she'd conquered rather than given into. "Yes," she said. "She always has." Ethan Blackridge nodded. He went back down the stairs and closed the door at the bottom, and Amelia stood in the room with her sleeping daughters and the rain hammering against the window, and she thought that this was the strangest ending to the worst 3 days of the last 2 years. She had come to Montana to find a home. The man she'd planned it with had turned her away at the station. She was sleeping in a stranger's house in the middle of a storm, with $35 worth of obligations and $1.25 coming per week, and she had no idea what came next. But the room was warm. The girls were asleep. The house was holding against the storm. She had had worse nights. She could work with this. She sat in the chair by the window and listened to the rain come down and let herself be still for the first time in 3 days, and when she eventually slept, she slept without dreaming. In the morning, the storm was gone as completely as if it had never existed, and Clearwater lay quiet and washed clean under a sky that had gone to the particular pale blue of early autumn in Montana. She went downstairs before the girls woke. Ethan Blackridge was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and what looked like a set of account ledgers spread in front of him. He had the focused, slightly pained expression of a man who was not naturally at ease with numbers, but was making himself do the work anyway. He looked up when she came in. She looked at the ledgers. "What is it?" she asked. He glanced back at the books, then at her, as though measuring how much to say. "Ranch has been running at a loss," he said finally. "Has been for 2 years. I'm a better hand with cattle than with columns." She hesitated. Then she said, "May I look?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned the ledger around and pushed it across the table. She sat down across from him and read. He poured her coffee without being asked, and she drank it while she worked through the numbers. And after about 10 minutes, she said, "You're paying double on the feed contract. Who did you negotiate this with?" He named a merchant. "He's been shorting you," she said. "Not by a lot at a time, but it accumulates. Look." She turned the ledger and pointed. "Here, here, and here. 3 times this year alone." Ethan Blackridge looked at the numbers she'd indicated. His jaw tightened slightly. "I can do your accounts," she said, "in exchange for room and board while I'm establishing myself in town. I'm already working for Ellen Miller 3 days a week, and for the doctor 2 mornings. I can give you what time is left." She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering a trade." He looked at her, not at the ledger, at her. "You know accounts?" he said. "I know accounts," she said. "I know household management. I know what things cost and where the money goes. My husband was a careful man, and he taught me to be a careful woman. And then he died, and I had to be more careful than either of us had planned." The steadiness in her own voice surprised her slightly. She hadn't talked about James that plainly to anyone in months. Ethan Blackridge picked up his coffee. He drank it. He looked at the ledger, then out the window at the morning sky. "Room and board," he said, "and the work you're already doing in town stays yours." "Yes." He thought about it for another moment. Just a moment. "All right," he said. He held out his hand across the table, and she shook it. And that was how it began. Not with letters, not with promises, not with any of the careful, beautiful language of correspondence that had turned out to mean nothing. With a handshake across a kitchen table on a morning after a storm, between 2 people who had both been through enough to know that the only thing worth building on was what you could verify with your own eyes. Upstairs, Emma woke up, and Amelia could hear her talking to Lily, explaining something with great urgency in the way Emma always woke, immediately, fully, as though she'd been interrupted mid-thought by sleep and now needed to finish it. Ethan Blackridge looked at the ceiling, following the sound. "She's always like that in the morning," Amelia said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, or maybe it was, and he'd just gotten out of the habit. "I'll get the stove going," he said, and he stood up and went to do exactly that. Amelia pulled the ledger back toward her and picked up the pencil he'd left on the table and started from the beginning, and for the first time since the stagecoach had pulled into Clearwater, she felt something that was almost like ground under her feet. The ledger told a story that Ethan Blackridge had been too close to see. Amelia spent the first morning going through it page by page, the way she'd been taught. Not looking for the big numbers, because the big numbers were obvious, but looking for the small ones, the recurring ones, the ones that added up so gradually that you didn't notice the weight until it was already too late to put it down. She had a pencil and a separate sheet of paper, and she made her own columns, cross-referencing dates against amounts. And by the time Emma had eaten breakfast and demanded to know where the chickens were and been redirected twice and finally settled on the kitchen floor with a tin cup and a wooden spoon that she was using as some kind of percussion instrument, Amelia had a clear picture of the Blackridge finances, and it was not a comfortable one. It wasn't disaster. That was the first thing she established because she had lived close enough to actual disaster in the last 2 years to know the difference. The ranch had land, clear title as far as she could read, and cattle, and equipment, and a functioning well, and a house that was structurally sound even if it had the emotional temperature of a tool shed. These were real assets, but the operating costs had crept up in ways that weren't obvious at first glance. The feed contract was only part of it. There were 2 supplier relationships that had quietly shifted in pricing over the past 18 months. Small increases that individually looked like normal market variation, but that together formed a pattern. Someone was taking advantage of a man who wasn't watching closely enough. She wrote it all out in a clear hand and left it on the table with a note. "These need renegotiating. The merchant contracts especially. I can go over this with you tonight if you want." She had the girls dressed and out the door by 8, walking back to town for her morning at Doc Hennessy's office, while Ethan was already out with the cattle, and she spent the 2 miles thinking about numbers instead of about Thomas Caldwell, which was an improvement. Doc Hennessy's filing system was exactly as particular as advertised. He had correspondence going back 11 years, and he knew where everything was, which meant that Amelia's job was less about organizing and more about maintaining a system that already existed, learning its logic, understanding what went where and why. She was good at learning systems. She had always been able to walk into something that someone else had built and understand it quickly, find its internal grammar, work within it without disrupting what made it function. She worked through the morning while the doctor saw patients. She could hear him through the wall, the murmur of voices, the particular careful tone he used with people who were frightened. He was a good doctor in the way that had nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with how he was in a room with someone who needed him. At 11, he came into the office where she was working and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd put on and stood there drinking it with the expression of a man who had just had a difficult hour. "The Harmon boy," he said. He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask. Some things didn't need explaining. "The filing for 81 is mislabeled," she said. "It's in the 82 cabinet. I didn't move it. I thought you should know before I changed anything." He looked at her over his spectacles. "Move it. I've been looking for a letter in there since March." She moved it and found the letter and put it on his desk, and he read it and said, "Good," and went back to his patients. And that was the entirety of their interaction for the morning, and it was exactly right. She picked up the girls from Mrs. Pollard. Emma had apparently reorganized Mrs. Pollard's button collection by color, which Mrs. Pollard did not appreciate, and walked back out to the Black Ridge Ranch in the early afternoon, and she started on the house. She had not been asked to work on the house. That was not part of the arrangement, but she walked through it in the way she'd started to the night before, looking at what was there, what was missing, what had slid. And the thing that became clear was that the house didn't need much. It needed attention. It needed the specific kind of care that comes not from money or materials, but from someone deciding that the place was worth caring about. She found cleaning rags and set Lily to wiping down the shelves in the front room, while Emma, who could not be trusted with cleaning rags because she would inevitably use them as a superhero cape or eat them, was given the job of moving the firewood from the disorganized pile outside into a neat stack along the side of the house. Emma took this job with intense seriousness, carrying one piece at a time with both arms, her small face completely committed to the task. Amelia started with the kitchen windows. They weren't dirty so much as they were gray, the kind of gray that comes from months of cooking steam and wood smoke and no one wiping them down. She washed them properly, and when the light came through clean, the whole kitchen changed. It became a room instead of a function. She found the curtains folded in a chest, plain cotton, nothing special, but they'd been put away rather than thrown out, which suggested they'd been put there by someone who intended to return for them. She hung them back up. They were wrinkled and she had no iron, but they were there, and they shifted the light in a way that made the room look like someone lived in it. Ethan came in at mid-afternoon. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the windows, at the curtains, at Lily, who had moved on to stacking the dishes more sensibly in the cupboard, at Emma, who was asleep on the floor near the stove, one arm over a piece of firewood she'd apparently carried in and then simply collapsed beside. He looked at Amelia. "This wasn't part of the agreement," he said. "No," she said. The light was better when the windows were clean." She wasn't sure how to explain it beyond that. She'd seen a house that was disappearing into itself, and she'd done what seemed obvious. He was quiet for a moment. Then he bent down and very carefully picked up the piece of firewood from under Emma's arm without waking her, and he set it by the stove, and he went back out. She hadn't expected him to say thank you. She didn't need him to, but there was something in the way he'd handled the firewood, quietly, carefully, paying attention to what was sleeping, that told her something she filed away without knowing exactly what to do with it yet. She went back to work. The first time Thomas Caldwell came to the ranch, it was a week after she'd arrived. She was in the yard with the girls. Emma had discovered the chickens and had appointed herself their supervisor, a role they were declining to honor, when she heard a horse on the road and looked up and recognized him before she fully registered who he was. It was something in the posture, the way he sat a horse like a man who wanted you to know he owned one. He pulled up at the yard fence and looked at her and didn't say anything for a moment, which was itself a kind of statement. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Caldwell." He looked at the house, at the yard, the chickens. Emma, who had stopped chasing chickens and was now staring at him with the focused, unblinking assessment of a very small child who has already determined she doesn't like someone. "You're living out here," he said. "I'm working here. There's a difference." "Is there?" He said it the way he'd said things at the station, like a man who'd already made up his mind and was just going through the motions of conversation. "People in town are talking." "People in town talk about everything," she said. "I've noticed that about Clearwater." Something moved in his face. Not quite anger, but the preparation for it. "You understand what this looks like. A single woman, out here with a man, no chaperone." "I'm working here," she said again. "I manage the household accounts and the housekeeping. It's employment. The same as anyone in town who works for wages. It's not the same and you know it. Because I'm a woman? Because of how it looks." She turned her face toward him and let the silence work for a moment. "With respect, mister Caldwell, you forfeited any standing to have opinions about my situation when you turned me away at the station." She said it quietly, without heat, because heat would have given him something to dismiss. If you were concerned about how things look, you might have thought about how it looks to publicly reject a woman and her children in front of half your town. His jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being answered directly. She could see that. The slight recalibration, the pause before he spoke again. "Ethan Blackridge is not who he appears to be," Thomas said. "I'm telling you that as a courtesy." "What is he then?" He didn't answer. He looked at her for a moment longer, then turned his horse and rode back down the road without another word. Emma walked up beside Amelia and stood watching the retreating horse with her arms crossed. "I don't like him," she announced. "You've never spoken to him," Amelia said. "I don't need to." Emma uncrossed her arms and turned back to the chickens. "He looked at us like we were dirt." Amelia watched the road where Thomas Caldwell had been. She thought about what he'd said. Ethan Blackridge is not who he appears to be. She thought about the way he'd said it, not like a warning, like a move being made. She went inside and looked at the ledger again. She told Ethan about it that evening. She had started to understand that he was a man who didn't produce conversation on his own, not because he had nothing to think or say, but because he'd lived alone long enough that silence had become his default state and he'd stopped fighting it. So she'd developed the habit of talking to him the way you'd gently restart a stopped clock. You had to give it something to work with. "Caldwell came by today," she said. "He was at the table with a cup of coffee. He looked up but didn't speak. He said, 'You're not who you appear to be.'" Ethan set down the cup. Something in his posture changed, a subtle settling, like a man who'd been waiting for something to arrive and just heard it knock. "He say anything else?" "No, he left." She paused. "Is there something I should know?" He thought about it. She could see him thinking, not stalling, actually working through a decision about how much to say and to whom. "Thomas Caldwell and I have history," he said finally. "His father and my father were neighbors. There was a dispute over the water rights on the eastern boundary when I was about 12. My father won it legally. Thomas's father never forgave him for it, and Thomas never forgave me for it by extension." He turned the cup in his hands. "When my father died and I took over the ranch, Thomas started making offers to buy the east section. I refused. He made the offers more aggressive. I refused again. After my wife died, the offers stopped and the other things started." "What other things?" "Rumors. Problems with suppliers that I couldn't pin down but that seemed too consistent to be coincidence. Someone spreading stories about the condition of my cattle before market. Small things, but enough of them." He paused. "I couldn't prove anything." She looked at him across the table. He wasn't performing any of this. He wasn't pitching it for sympathy or trying to recruit her to his side. He was just reporting facts the way she'd reported the discrepancies in the ledger. "Here's what I know. Here's what I can't prove." "The supplier contracts," she said. "What about them?" "The ones where the pricing shifted. I told you those needed renegotiating. But the shifts didn't happen arbitrarily, did they? Someone influenced those suppliers." He looked at her. "I've thought about that." "Can you show me everything? All of it? The correspondence, the accounts, the records of the offers he made on the east section, All of it. He was quiet for a moment. Why? Because if there's a pattern, it can be documented, and documented patterns are harder to dismiss than rumors. She looked at him. I know accounts. I know what I'm looking at. Let me look. He held her gaze for a moment, then went to the back of the house where she hadn't yet been. A small room that had apparently been his father's study, still holding boxes of papers and correspondence and ranch records going back 20 years. He brought out 3 of them and set them on the table. It'll take time, he said. I know. She pulled the first box toward her. Go do your work. I'll start. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, something between surprise and recalibration. The look of a man who kept expecting her to need more than she actually needed. Then he went back outside, and she opened the first box, and the story inside it started to come clear. Ruth Alderman told her about the gossip on Thursday. Amelia was in the store picking up flour and beeswax and a packet of needles, small necessities, carefully budgeted, when Ruth set her hands on the counter and said, in the manner of someone who has decided to be direct because it's more useful than being careful, you should know what's being said. Tell me. That you went out to the Blackridge place because Thomas rejected you, and you needed someone to fall back on. That you're using Ethan the same way you tried to use Thomas, for security. That the children are your leverage, not your family. She said it without embellishment, just delivered the facts of it. I don't believe any of it. I want that clear. I know you don't. Amelia counted her coins out on the counter. Who's saying it? Clara Hutchins started it, but she gets her ideas from her husband, and her husband gets his ideas from wherever the money tells him. Ruth bagged the flour. Jeb Hutchins does business with Thomas Caldwell. There it was. Not gossip spreading organically the way gossip does, Mom. Gossip being fed. Someone putting words into circulation and letting them move. She walked back to the ranch that afternoon with the supplies and 2 children and a clearer understanding of the situation she'd walked into, and she made herself think about it honestly. She was a woman alone in a town that hadn't chosen her, working for a man whose enemy was actively trying to undermine him, with a week's worth of wages saved and 2 daughters she was responsible for. Any rational reading of this situation would suggest that she should cut her losses, take the Miller and Hennessy work, find a room in town, and stay as far from Ethan Blackridge's complications as she could afford to. She thought about this all the way up the road and through the front gate. Then she went inside and sat back down with the papers. She was 3 boxes in when she found it. It was a letter, 7 years old, from a land surveyor, addressed to Thomas Caldwell's father and clearly misfiled in a stack of correspondence that had ended up in the Blackridge records when the 2 properties had exchanged documents during the original water rights dispute. The misfiling was probably accidental, but what the letter said was not accidental at all. It was a survey report. It described the eastern boundary of the Blackridge property in terms that directly contradicted the boundary Thomas Caldwell had been claiming in his purchase offers. Specifically, it placed the water source entirely within Blackridge land, which meant that the entire water rights dispute Thomas had cited as justification for his family's grievance had been founded on a survey he knew, or should have known, was inaccurate. She read it twice. Then she copied it out in her careful hand onto a clean sheet of paper, noting the date, the surveyor's name, the document reference, and where she had found it. She was still copying when she heard Ethan come in. She waited until he'd washed and poured his coffee before she said, "Come sit down. I found something." He read the letter. He read her copy. He set them both down and was quiet for a long moment. "My father never saw this," he said. "I don't think so. It was misfiled in a stack from the boundary exchange. Someone could have done it deliberately, or it could have been honest chaos. Either way, your father litigated the water rights dispute without knowing this document existed. And Thomas's father had the survey done, which means Thomas's father knew what it said. And if Thomas inherited his father's records, he knows what it says too." Ethan picked up the letter again and looked at it. He's known for years that the water rights claim was built on a false survey. He fought it anyway. He lost, and he kept fighting it through other means. He set the letter down. All of it. The supplier pressure, the rumors, the offers. He's been trying to get back what his father tried to steal the first time. "Yes," Amelia said, "and now you have the document that says so." He looked at her across the table. Not with the recalibrating surprise he'd been showing her before. Something different. A recognition, like he was seeing the whole shape of something he'd only known the edges of. "You found this in 3 days," he said. "I had good reason to look carefully." He was quiet again, then, "Thank you." It was the first time he'd said it. She'd told herself she didn't need it, and that was true, but hearing it was still different from not hearing it in a way she couldn't entirely explain. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "One document is evidence of one thing. If Thomas has been doing this systematically, there'll be more. I need more time with the records." "Take whatever time you need." She looked back at the papers. "The supplier contracts. Can you get copies of what they gave you? The original agreements with dates?" "I can write to the suppliers." "Do it. And get me the names of anyone else in the valley who's had disputes with Thomas Caldwell in the last 10 years. Because if this is a pattern, other people have records too. And records from multiple directions are harder to ignore than records from one ranch." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Done what?" "This. Built a case out of paper." She considered that. "My husband used to say that paper remembers what people forget. He had a dispute with his employer once. The rail company shorted his wages for 3 months and then denied it. He'd kept every receipt, every single one. He won." She looked at the survey letter. "He was a careful man." "What happened to him?" She was quiet for a moment. Not with grief, exactly. She was past the shape of grief that immobilized. More with the particular weight of something that was finished and real and couldn't be changed. The rail yard. An accident. He'd been careful about everything except the one thing that mattered most, and there wasn't any paper for that. Ethan was quiet. He didn't say he was sorry, which would have been the conventional thing and would have required her to say something back about it, and she was tired of that particular exchange. He just let it sit, and that was better. After a moment she said, "I need the names." He got up and found paper and a pen and started writing, and she went back to the boxes, and they worked in silence on opposite sides of the table until the fire burned down. Lily came to her 2 weeks in with the question Amelia had been waiting for. They were in the small room upstairs. It had become their room now, genuinely, with the girls' few things arranged on the shelf, and Amelia's dress hung on the peg by the door. And Amelia was mending a tear in Emma's hem while Emma slept with her characteristic abandon, and Lily sat on the bed with her knees pulled to her chest, and the watchful expression she'd been wearing more than usual. "Are we staying?" Lily asked. Amelia kept her eyes on the mending. She turned the question over first before answering, because Lily was not a child who accepted vague reassurance. She was 6 now. Her birthday had come and gone during the storm week, which Amelia felt bad about, though Ethan had somehow produced a small cake that Amelia suspected had more to do with biscuit dough and dried fruit than any actual baking skill, and Lily had eaten 2 pieces and declared it acceptable. And she understood more about their situation than most adults would have assumed she did. "I don't know yet," Amelia said. "Honestly." "Do you want to stay?" Amelia looked up from the mending. Lily was watching her with those steady, dark eyes. "I want us to have a home," Amelia said. "I'm not sure yet what that looks like." "I like it here," Lily said. "Emma likes it. She cried less here than anywhere since Papa." That landed quietly. Amelia kept her face even. "I know," she said. "Mr. Blackridge fixed Emma's boot," Lily said. "The strap was broken and she couldn't put it on and she was crying and he just fixed it. He didn't make a thing of it." Amelia had not known about the boot. She thought about that. Ethan finding Emma crying over a broken strap, fixing it without ceremony, not making it into a moment. The way he'd carried Emma upstairs that first night. The way he'd lifted the firewood from under her sleeping arm without waking her. All the small attention she'd been observing without quite looking at directly. He wasn't trying, that was the thing. He wasn't performing warmth or calculating what was required. He was just there, practical and present in the way of someone who noticed what needed doing and did it, without keeping score. "He's a good man," Amelia said carefully. "Better than the other one," Lily said with the frank certainty of a child who had not yet learned to be politic about people who'd hurt her family. Amelia looked back at the mending. "Yes," she said, "better than the other one." She finished the hem and folded it and set it at the foot of the bed, and she sat for a moment in the quiet room with her sleeping younger daughter and her too perceptive older one, and the sound of the ranch settling into night outside, and she let herself think about what Lily had asked. Do you want to stay? She wanted something she was having trouble naming. She had arrived in Clearwater in pursuit of a plan, a careful, practical plan, executed through letters and documented agreements, and everything she could do to make sure she wasn't dependent on hope. And the plan had collapsed. But what she had now wasn't a plan. It was something that was building itself out of daily work and small decisions, and a ledger full of someone else's problems and the quiet company of a man who fixed children's boots without making it a story. She had learned to distrust things she wanted. Wanting was how she'd ended up on a platform being humiliated. Wanting was what she'd been careful to keep out of the numbers and the documents and the clear-eyed inventory of assets and obligations. She was good at the practical. She was less sure about the rest of it. She got up and checked the window latch. The nights were getting colder, and went back downstairs to finish what she'd been working on. Ethan was still at the table. He had a letter in front of him, and the expression on his face was the one she'd started to think of as his worried one, though worried was probably too soft a word for whatever that look actually contained. What is it? She said. He passed her the letter without speaking. It was from a man named Garrett in the county seat, a lawyer from the heading, and it said that Thomas Caldwell had filed a formal complaint alleging that Ethan Blackridge had been conducting his cattle operation in violation of the county's newly codified grazing ordinances, and that a hearing had been set for 6 weeks hence. She read it carefully. She looked at the specific ordinance being cited. Then she read it again. These ordinances, she said, when were they codified? According to that, 4 months ago. And when did Thomas Caldwell take a seat on the county land committee? Ethan's jaw tightened. 6 months ago. She set the letter down. He wrote the ordinance, she said, or had someone write it. Yes. She looked at the stack of papers she'd been building. Her careful documentation, the survey letter, the supplier records, the growing pattern of it. She thought about what she'd said to Ethan. Documented patterns are harder to dismiss. She thought about what that actually required. Not just documents, but someone to present them. Someone to make the county see what they added up to. Who's your lawyer? She asked. Don't have one in the county. Used to use a man in Billings, but he retired 2 years ago. You need one. She thought for a moment. Ruth Alderman will know who's reliable. I'll ask her tomorrow. She looked at him. This is his move. Not his last move, but a big one. He's trying to use the law the way he used the rumors. Make it look procedural while it's actually personal. Ethan was looking at her, not at the letter. You're not afraid of this, he said. It wasn't a question. She thought about that. Fear was the wrong word. She was alert. The way you got when you saw the shape of something and understood that the shape mattered. I'm careful, she said. Afraid and careful are different things. He said nothing. But he held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and something in that look settled into the room like a weight being gently set down. Get some sleep, she said. I'll finish up here. He stood and moved toward the stairs, and then he stopped and said, without turning around, the curtains in the kitchen. What about them? My wife put them up, he said. 6 years ago, right after we built the place. When she died, I took them down because I couldn't. He paused. I put them in the chest. I kept thinking I'd know when to put them back up. She didn't say anything. I'm glad they're back, he said. He went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after she heard his door close, and she looked at the curtains. Plain cotton, slightly wrinkled, nothing special. And she thought about the woman who had hung them the first time, and what it had taken for a man to put them away, and what it meant that he had kept them. She turned back to the papers. There was still work to do, and she was still the most careful person in this house, and that mattered more right now than anything else she was feeling. She worked until the fire needed tending. Then she banked it, turned off the lamp, and went upstairs to the room that was starting to feel, in the least convenient possible way, like something she might not be able to walk away from. The lawyer Ruth recommended was named Harold Foss, and he operated out of a single room above the saddle shop in Mill Haven, 12 miles east of Clearwater, which was close enough to matter and far enough from Thomas Caldwell's orbit to be useful. Amelia made the trip herself, on a Tuesday, borrowing Ethan's second horse, a gray mare named Patience, who had apparently been named by someone with a sense of irony because she was not patient at all and spent the first 4 miles trying to take the bit in her teeth. Amelia held her steady and let her settle, and by the time they got to Millhaven, they had reached a working arrangement. The girls stayed with Ethan. She hadn't planned it that way. She'd assumed she would leave them with Mrs. Pollard or Ruth Alderman. But Emma had attached herself to Ethan's leg that morning at the gate and announced that she was staying, and Lily had said quietly that she'd help with the chickens, and Ethan had looked at Amelia with an expression that was either helpless or resigned or something between the two, and said, "Go, I'll manage." She'd ridden out with the tin box of documents on her lap and the awareness that she'd just left her daughters with a man she'd known for 3 weeks, which was either an act of practical good judgment or a sign that something in her assessment of the situation had shifted further than she'd been paying attention to. Harold Foss turned out to be a small, dry man of about 60, with ink stains on his right hand and reading spectacles that he wore pushed up on his forehead until he needed them, which meant they moved up and down constantly throughout their conversation like a second set of eyebrows. He read everything she put in front of him without speaking, and when he was done, he said, "How did you find the survey letter?" "It was misfiled in with the boundary exchange documents. I was going through everything systematically." "Does Caldwell know you have it?" "I don't believe so." He pushed his spectacles up. "He will, once the hearing proceeds. Discovery works both ways." He looked at the orderly stack of copies she'd made. "These are your copies?" "Originals are secured at the ranch. I made copies before I brought these." He looked at her over the spectacles. "Mr. Blackridge hired himself a careful woman." "Mr. Blackridge hired himself an accountant," she said. "The rest happened to come with it." He almost smiled. Almost. "The grazing ordinance complaint is a nuisance filing. I can handle that. The ordinance has a grandfather provision, and Blackridge's operation predates it by 15 years. That case won't survive a serious hearing." He tapped the survey letter. "This, though, this is something else. This establishes that the foundational grievance Thomas Caldwell has used to justify 20 years of behavior was based on a survey his family knew was inaccurate. That doesn't just affect the Blackridge case. That affects every land dispute and every business dealing that Caldwell has been party to since he took over his father's operation." "How many people might that cover?" "In this valley?" He picked up his pen. "I'd want to know that before I walked into any room with it. A document that affects one man is leverage. A document that affects 15 men is a movement." He looked at her. "You said Blackridge knows of other ranchers who've had disputes with Caldwell." "He's been compiling names. I asked him to 2 weeks ago." "Get me the list." She nodded. She gathered the copies back into the tin box with the precise movements of someone who had been careful with papers for long enough that it was physical habit. "What's the timeline on the hearing?" 6 weeks. I'll file for a continuance to buy us more time, though Caldwell will fight it." He leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Whitaker, I want to be honest with you about something." "Please." "Thomas Caldwell is not a man who loses gracefully. He's lost before. The original water rights case, for instance. And the way he handled losing that has been the source of every complication in this situation since. If you pursue this, and if it succeeds, you should be prepared for him to become considerably less subtle in his responses." She looked at him. "He's already tried to buy me off. He came to the ranch and offered me money to leave." Foss went still. "When was this?" 10 days ago. He came to the gate." She paused. "He said I had no place beside a man like Ethan. He said I should take the money and give my children a better life somewhere else." "And you said?" "I said no." "Did anyone witness the conversation?" She thought back. She'd been in the yard. Lily had been behind her, near the barn door, close enough to hear, probably. "My daughter, she's 6. "How is she in front of people? Confident?" Amelia thought about Lily standing at the station with her jaw set and her sister behind her. "Very. Good. That may matter." He made a note. "Write down everything you remember about that conversation. Date, time, exact words as best you can recall. Sign it and date it and give it to me." She started to write it right there, from memory, sitting in Harold Foss's office above the saddle shop, because that was the kind of person James had made her into, and the kind of person she'd remained even after James was gone. She wrote it completely and clearly, and when she was done, she signed it and dated it, and Foss read it and said, "Good," in exactly the tone Doc Hennessy used, and she thought that competent men all had the same economy of approval. She got back to the ranch in the late afternoon to find Emma asleep in the barn on a pile of hay with a cat she had apparently befriended, and Lily sitting on the fence watching Ethan work with a young horse in the near paddock. The horse was not cooperating. It was a young bay with an attitude about being handled, and Ethan was working it on a long line, patient and quiet, not forcing anything, just insisting, gently, consistently insisting, that the horse move the way he was asking. He'd been at it long enough that his shirt was damp, and there was dust on his hat, and he had the focused expression of someone doing a thing that required all of him. Lily had her chin on her arms on the top rail and was watching with her whole self, the way she watched things she found genuinely interesting. Amelia tied the gray mare and came to stand at the fence. "He's been doing that for an hour," Lily said without looking away from the paddock. "He doesn't get angry." "No," Amelia said. "Papa used to say you could tell everything about a man by how he treated something that couldn't talk back." Amelia stood there for a moment with that. "Your papa was right," she said. Lily nodded slowly, still watching. The bay horse was beginning to come around, the resistance in its neck softening, its steps following the line with less argument. Ethan saw it happen and gave it slack, just a little, just enough to tell the horse it had done something right. "He's good at it," Lily said. It was not a child's assessment. It was a verdict. That evening, when the girls were in bed, Amelia told Ethan about the meeting with Foss. She told him about the grandfather provision and the continuance and the timeline, and she told him what Foss had said about the survey letter, that it was bigger than one ranch, that it could affect anyone Caldwell had ever pressured using the authority of a grievance he knew was manufactured. Ethan listened to all of it without interrupting. "He wants the list of names," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Some of those men won't want to be on a list. They've settled, made peace with their situations, even if the peace wasn't fair. Coming back to it means trouble. I know that. Do you want me to approach them?" She thought about it. "Not yet. Not until Foss knows what he has and tells us what he needs. Some of them might not be necessary. If we can establish the pattern with what we already have, and if we can't, then we'll go to them honestly and tell them the whole situation and let them decide for themselves." She looked at him. "They deserve that. The honest version." He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He said, "That's not always how these things are done." "I know, but it's how I do them." He looked at her, and there was something in that look that she had started to recognize as the specific expression he got when she said something that matched what he thought, but that he hadn't said himself. Like confirmation of something he'd been quietly carrying. "Thomas came to the ranch again today," he said. She went still. "When?" "This morning, after you left. He didn't come to the gate this time. He came to the house." He paused. "Girls were inside. He didn't know I was in the barn. He talked to them through the door." Something cold moved through her. "What did he say?" "Lily told him I wasn't home and you weren't home and she wasn't going to open the door." He said it with a flatness that told her he was keeping the anger underneath the words deliberately, controlling its volume. He told her, through the door, to a 6-year-old, that her mother was making a mistake and that it was going to hurt their family. Amelia set down her pencil. "He said that to Lily." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't emptiness but pressure, something building that she was managing carefully, the way you manage a fire you need but cannot afford to let spread. "Is she all right?" "She's Lily," Ethan said. She told him she already knew what mistakes looked like, and he was one of them, and then she didn't say anything else until he left. Amelia closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them. "I need to write that down," she said. "Date, time, what he said, what she said." "I already did." He pushed a folded piece of paper across the table. His handwriting was large and plain and completely legible. The handwriting of someone who didn't write often, but wrote honestly when they did. She unfolded it and read it. She added it to the box. "He's changing his approach," she said. "He came to me first, tried to buy me off. When that didn't work, he came to the children." She looked at the box. "He's trying to find which thread to pull. He's looking for where we're weak." "Are we weak somewhere?" She looked at him. She thought about what Thomas had said at the gate. "A poor woman like you has no place beside a man like Ethan." She thought about what the town was saying, and about Clara Hutchins, and about the way reputation could be used as a tool when you didn't have anything else. "He thinks I'm the weak point," she said. "He thinks if he can make me feel like enough of an outsider, I'll leave voluntarily, save him the trouble." "You're not going to leave," Ethan said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "I'm not." He nodded once, like something that had been uncertain was now settled. Thomas Caldwell made his real move on a Wednesday in the third week of October, and he made it publicly, which was how she knew he'd stopped being careful. The county commissioner, a man named Aldous Webb, who Amelia had seen twice in the general store, and who had the particular quality of a man who went in whichever direction the strongest wind was blowing, called a public meeting in the town hall to discuss what he described as concerns about the operation of the Black Ridge Ranch and its effect on the wider community. It was posted on the door of every business in Clearwater, which meant Ruth Alderman tore the notice off her own door and brought it directly to Amelia. "He's using Webb," Ruth said. She put the notice on the counter. "Webb's been in Thomas's pocket since the road commission business 2 years ago. Whatever happens in that meeting, Thomas wrote the agenda." Amelia read the notice. Public meeting. All concerned citizens welcome. When? Friday evening. 2 days. She sent word to Harold Foss by the mail rider. She went through everything in the tin box again, not because she'd forgotten what was there, but because she needed the physical act of reviewing it, confirming what she had, locating its gaps, understanding what it could and couldn't do. She found 2 more letters that she'd flagged but not fully analyzed, and she worked through them that evening while Ethan sat across from her and went through the names on his list, crossing off the ones he thought wouldn't come and marking the ones who might. They had been doing this more often, sitting across from each other with work between them, the room quiet except for the fire and the sound of pencils and the occasional distant sound of one of the girls shifting in sleep upstairs. It had become its own kind of pattern, and she was aware of it in the same way she'd become aware of the curtains in the kitchen, with a recognition that something had changed in the texture of the place without her quite deciding to change it. Walter Pruitt, Ethan said. He was going through his list. Lost his East grazing contract 3 years ago. Blamed bad luck, but he always thought Caldwell had something to do with it. He's stubborn. If he comes, he'll stay. Will he come? If I ask him directly, we're old enough friends. Ask him directly, then. She turned a page. And the Garza family. You mentioned them before. Marco Garza lost a water access dispute with Caldwell 2 years ago. Hired a lawyer, lost anyway. He's angry enough, but he doesn't trust that anything will be different this time. If he sees the survey letter, he might. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That letter touches something in people here. The idea that the whole foundation of it was crooked from the start. That they lost to a lie that Caldwell knew was a lie. He paused. It's one thing to lose, it's another to know you were set up to lose. I know, she said. She said it simply, and he looked at her and said nothing, but the silence acknowledged something. She kept her eyes on the papers. The night before the public meeting, Thomas Caldwell came to the Black Ridge Ranch for the 3rd time. This time he came after dark, and this time he brought 2 men with him. Amelia heard the horses from upstairs. She had not been asleep. She'd been sitting by the window with the tin box open, going through everything one last time, and when she heard the horses, she was out of her chair and at the top of the stairs before she'd consciously decided to move. Ethan was already at the door. He'd heard them too. She came down quietly. She checked that the girl's door was closed, and then she stood back from the front window where she could see without being seen, and she watched Ethan go out onto the porch and face Thomas Caldwell in the dark. Thomas didn't get off his horse. The 2 men behind him didn't either. They were big, both of them, in the way that's meant to be noticed. Ethan, Thomas said. Pleasant. The kind of pleasant that is a very thin surface over something else. Thomas. Ethan's voice was level. He stood with his arms at his sides on the porch steps, and he didn't shift his weight. I came to have a reasonable conversation, Thomas said. One neighbor to another, before this becomes something we'll all regret. It's late, Ethan said. You could have come in daylight. I've tried coming in daylight. Your arrangement here seems to have made that complicated. He glanced at the house, at the lit window where Amelia stood back in the shadow. I know she's in there. She can hear this if she wants. Amelia stayed where she was. What I want you to understand, Thomas said, his voice still carrying that thin veneer of reason, is that there's a simple way for this to end. You sell me the East section, fair market price, nothing below. I drop the complaint, I withdraw from the county committee hearing, and whatever that woman has been putting together in those boxes of yours stays between us. Everybody moves on. Ethan said nothing. You've got 2 children in that house, Thomas said, children who aren't yours, a woman who arrived in this town with nothing. I respect what you're trying to do, I do, but you're making their situation harder, not easier. A man in a legal fight doesn't have time or resources for a family. Ethan let the silence sit for a moment. Then, you're not here to be reasonable, Thomas. You're here at night with 2 men behind you because you want me to feel what that looks like. So let's not pretend this is about neighbors. Thomas's pleasant expression didn't change exactly, but something underneath it shifted. The East section, he said. Think about it before tomorrow. I've thought about it, Ethan said. No. Thomas looked at the house again. He looked at it for long enough that it was meant to be noticed. Then he turned his horse, and the 2 men turned theirs, and they rode back down the dark road, and the sound of them faded into the night. Ethan stood on the porch for a moment after they were gone. Then he came back inside and closed the door and stood in the kitchen and said nothing. Amelia came out of the shadow by the window. She had the tin box under her arm. He knows about the boxes, she said. He's guessing. He knows you've been going through the records. He knows enough to be worried. She set the box on the table. Tomorrow changes something regardless of how the meeting goes. Once he knows what we have, the pressure increases. She looked at Ethan. The 2 men he brought. Hired hands. I know them. They work the Caldwell spread. He brought them because he wanted me to count them. And I counted them. He looked at her steadily. I've been in harder situations. She believed him. There was something in the way he stood, not defiant, not performing, that told her he was telling the plain truth. He had been in harder situations, and he had managed them, and he was still here. The ranch was still here. Whatever Thomas Caldwell had been doing to him for 3 years had not moved him yet. He called the girls children who aren't yours, she said. Ethan was quiet. I want you to know, she said, that whatever happens tomorrow, what he did today, coming here in the dark, I'm adding it to the record. That's not an accident, what he does. It's a system, and I'm going to document every piece of it. Ethan looked at her for a moment. He offered you money once, he said. At the gate? You said no. What would have happened if you'd said yes? She thought about it honestly. I would have taken the girls somewhere else and started over and tried to forget I'd been in Clearwater. She paused. But I would have known what I'd walked away from, and I would have known why. And why is that enough to stay? It was the most direct question he had asked her. She stood with it for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because knowing it and saying it were different kinds of exposure. Because my husband kept every receipt, she said finally. Because he knew you don't walk away from things that matter just because someone with more power tells you to. He was careful about everything except the one thing he couldn't have known would kill him. I don't know how to be any other way. She looked at the tin box. And because what's in there is right. The survey letter is real. What Thomas did is real. Walking away from something real because it's hard. I don't know how to do that. I've tried, and I can't. He was very quiet. The fire had burned low, and the kitchen had the particular stillness of a house where everyone else is asleep, and 2 people are the only awake things in it. I should have told you about the water rights history sooner, he said. When you first arrived, I got used to managing it alone. You're not alone anymore, she said. She said it plainly, the way he said things, without dressing it up. He looked at her. There was something in the way he was looking at her that she had been carefully not examining directly for the past 2 weeks, because examining it would require her to decide what to do about it, and she had enough decisions in front of her without adding that one. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's going to require both of us." She took the tin box upstairs. She sat on the bed for a long time, not sleeping, listening to the ranch settle into the deep quiet of the Montana night. The town hall was full. She hadn't expected that. She'd told herself that a public meeting about ranch grazing ordinances would bring out the people with a direct stake and a few curious neighbors. But the room was packed. Farmers, merchants, ranchers, women who had come with their husbands, and women who had come alone. And in the back row, still in his road dust, Walter Pruitt, who Ethan had asked directly and who had apparently come directly. She sat beside Ethan in the third row with the tin box on her knees. Ruth Alderman had taken a seat 2 rows back. Doc Hennessy was near the side wall. The Garza family, Marco and his wife and their oldest son, were on the far left. Thomas Caldwell was at the front beside Commissioner Webb, and he was wearing his good suit. Webb opened the meeting with the practiced pomposity of a man who understood that authority was partly theater and laid out the complaint against the Black Ridge operation. He cited the ordinance. He cited the filing. He was careful not to name Amelia directly, but there was a long pause after he said recent changes at the Black Ridge Ranch that was designed to point at her without pointing. Then Thomas stood up and spoke. He was smooth. She would give him that. He spoke about community standards and about the integrity of the valley's land agreements and about his personal respect for Ethan Blackridge as a man, which he managed to make sound like the most devastating kind of insult. He talked about the importance of the county's legal framework. He did not say anything that was directly false. He sat down to what Amelia observed was approximately half the room nodding and the other half sitting with the careful stillness of people who were not agreeing but had not yet decided to disagree out loud. Webb asked if anyone wanted to respond on behalf of the Black Ridge operation. Ethan started to stand. Amelia put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. She stood up instead. The room shifted. She could feel it, the recalibration, people looking at her and then looking at Thomas and then back at her, doing their own accounting of what this was. She had not planned a speech. She had planned something better than a speech. "Commissioner Webb," she said. Her voice was steady. "Before this proceeds, I'd like to enter some documents into the record. I believe they're material to the questions this meeting is supposed to address." Webb looked uncertain. He looked at Thomas. Thomas's expression had gone carefully neutral. "What documents?" Webb said. "A survey letter dated some 20 years ago, establishing the accurate boundaries of the Black Ridge property, including the water rights that have been the stated basis of Mr. Caldwell's long-standing grievance with the Black Ridge family." She opened the tin box. "Copies for the record. I have the originals secured with legal counsel." She passed the copies to Webb. She kept her voice even and her hand steady. "I'd also like to note for the record," she continued, "that 10 days ago, Mr. Caldwell approached me directly at the Black Ridge Gate and offered me a sum of money to leave Clearwater permanently, specifically to remove my daughters and myself from the Black Ridge property and not return. When I declined, he approached my 6-year-old daughter through a closed door and told her that her mother was making a mistake that would hurt her family." She paused. "I have written accounts of both incidents, witnessed and signed." The room had gone very quiet. Thomas Caldwell was not neutral anymore. There was color in his face and a set to his jaw that she recognized from the station platform, from the gate at the ranch, from every encounter where his sense of how things should go had been disrupted. "Furthermore," she said, "I have documentation showing that over the past 3 years, at least 2 supplier contracts used by the Black Ridge operation were subjected to price manipulation that appears to have an external origin. I have correspondence that will be provided to legal counsel and, if necessary, to the county surveyor's office for formal review." She closed the box. She looked at Webb. "This meeting was filed as a concern about grazing ordinances. I'd asked the commissioner to look at the grandfather provision in Section 4 of that ordinance before proceeding, which Mr. Blackridge's legal counsel has already flagged in a formal response." She sat down. The room took a moment to remember how to breathe. Walter Pruitt, in the back row, said clearly to the man sitting next to him, loud enough that it wasn't truly private. "She's got the survey letter, Tom's father's survey." Marco Garza said nothing, but he was looking at the copy of the letter that had made its way to his row, and his expression was the expression of a man reading something he had needed to read for 2 years. Thomas Caldwell stood up again. He looked at Amelia. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at the station, with the flat, assessing coldness of a man taking inventory. But this time there was something else underneath it. Not respect. Something closer to a reevaluation. A man who had decided a person was a minor obstacle, discovering that the obstacle had architecture he hadn't accounted for. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said with the careful pleasantness, "arrived in Clearwater 6 weeks ago with nothing. No connections, no resources, no standing in this community. I think we should consider carefully the weight we give to documents assembled by someone with an obvious personal interest in—" "The documents assembled themselves," she said. She said it quietly, and she didn't stand up. "I just went through the boxes and put them in order. The survey letter has been sitting in the Black Ridge records for 20 years. The supplier records are the supplier's own paperwork. The accounts of Mr. Caldwell's approaches to me are written in my own hand and signed by me, and my daughter can speak to what she heard at the door." She looked at him. "I didn't write any of it. It was already there. I just read it." Thomas Caldwell had enough control not to let whatever he was feeling cross his face completely. But around the room she could see it, the shift, the quiet collective recalculation of people who had been watching a version of this situation and were now seeing a different version. Not all of them. Not everyone changes their mind in a public meeting, but enough of them, and in the faces of enough people whose opinions carried weight. Ruth Alderman, Doc Hennessy, Walter Pruitt, Marco Garza, that the room felt different than it had 15 minutes ago. Webb called a recess. Ethan didn't say anything. He took the tin box from her hands when she went to lift it and carried it himself, and they walked out of the town hall into the cold October evening and stood together on the steps while people moved around them, and the thing that had been building in the Clearwater Valley for 20 years and in the last 6 weeks in particular sat in the air between them, complicated and unresolved, but changed in some fundamental way that neither of them was ready to name yet. "You shouldn't have done that alone," he said. "Someone had to do it, and you were going to be too angry to be careful," she said. "You would have talked about Thomas and the land. I talked about the documents. It's different." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the street, not at her. "I've been fighting this for 3 years," he said. "Alone." "I know. And you walked in 6 weeks ago with a broken boot and a tin box, and you just—" He stopped. "I read what was already there," she said. "That's all." He turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and whatever was between them at that moment was real enough to have weight and complicated enough to have no simple name, and she was too careful a woman to do anything with it here, on the steps of the town hall, with Thomas Caldwell's men within eyesight, and a room full of people coming and going around them. "Let's go get the girls," she said. He nodded. He kept the tin box. They walked to the wagon together in the dark, and behind them the town hall light spilled out across the October street, and somewhere in the building Walter Pruitt was talking to Marco Garza, with the energy of 2 men discovering they had been wronged by the same person, and the thing that Amelia had put in motion with a tin box and 20 years of misfiled paper was still moving, gathering itself, not finished yet, but no longer quiet. Commissioner Webb adjourned the meeting without a resolution, which was exactly what Thomas Caldwell had wanted and exactly what Amelia had expected. An adjournment without resolution meant the complaint stayed open. It meant the pressure on the Black Ridge operation continued in a legal gray area where Thomas could keep using the county process as a slow lever, not to win outright, but to cost. Legal fees, time, distraction, the grinding uncertainty of something unresolved hanging over every decision. She had seen this tactic in the documents. It was the same thing he'd done with the supplier contracts, with the rumors, with all of it. He didn't need to win. He needed to make the fight expensive enough that the other side surrendered just to make it stop. She understood that now completely, and understanding it made her more careful, not less. She sent word to Harold Foss the following morning with a full account of the meeting, what had been said, what had been entered, what Webb had done and not done. Foss wrote back within 3 days. His letter was short and precise in the way of a man who had been doing this long enough not to waste words. The survey letter, combined with the witness accounts of Caldwell's direct approaches, created a foundation for a counterfiling. Not a defensive response to his complaint, but a separate action challenging the basis of his land claims and documenting the pattern of coercion. It would need to go to a higher authority than Webb, the Territorial Land Office in Helena, which sat well outside Thomas Caldwell's local influence. It would also take time. More time than she had originally calculated. She sat with Foss's letter for a long time that evening, turning over the timeline in her head. 6 weeks since she'd arrived. The girls were settled, genuinely settled, not just quieted down. Lily was helping with the ranch accounts alongside Amelia now, which had started as a way to keep her occupied and had turned into something else when it became clear that Lily had her mother's instinct for numbers. Emma had made the chickens into a personal project of such organizational ambition that the chickens appeared to have given up resisting and simply went where she pointed. The ranch itself looked different than it had, not transformed, not perfect, but alive in a way that functioning households were alive, with purpose and order and the small warmth of daily things done consistently. She was also aware, more clearly than she wanted to be, that she had been rebuilding something she had not planned to rebuild, and that the man across the table from her every evening was not an abstraction, but a person she had come to know in the specific way you come to know someone when you work alongside them through difficulty. She knew how he moved when he was tired. She knew the particular quality of his silence when he was working through something difficult, different from his silence when he was simply quiet. She knew that he heated his coffee twice because he always let the first cup go cold while he was thinking, and that he kept a letter in the breast pocket of his work coat that she had never asked about and he had never mentioned. She was a careful woman. She had been a careful woman since before she had reasons to be, and careful women did not let themselves want things they couldn't afford to lose. She put Foss's letter in the tin box and went back to work. Shut. Rebecca Blackridge arrived on a Thursday with no warning and a trunk that required 2 men to carry, and an opinion about everything she encountered, delivered in a rapid, clear voice that cut through rooms the way a good knife cuts through something it's meant for. She was Ethan's younger sister by 4 years, and she had been living in Billings for the past 2 years, working as a clerk for a land title company, a fact that had apparently not come up in any conversation Amelia and Ethan had had, which told Amelia something about how thoroughly Ethan kept the compartments of his life separate. Rebecca walked into the kitchen, looked at the curtains, looked at the clean windows, looked at Emma, who was sitting on the floor surrounded by what appeared to be every pot in the house arranged by size, and then looked at Amelia and said, "You must be the woman who's been going through the boxes. Harold Foss wrote me." Amelia set down the pencil she'd been holding. "He didn't tell us he'd written to you. Harold doesn't tell people things until he has a reason to," Rebecca said. She pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited, which was not rudeness so much as efficiency. She was a woman who had calibrated which social formalities were worth the time and which weren't. "He told me about the survey letter and the counterfiling, and he told me that someone had gone through 20 years of ranch records in 3 weeks and organized them into a case." She looked at Amelia directly. "That was you?" "Yes." "Ethan doesn't organize things. He manages them, which is different." She pulled off her traveling gloves. "I worked for a land title company for 2 years. Before that, I worked for a claims adjuster in Denver. I know what a fraudulent land operation looks like from the paperwork side, and I know what it takes to unwind one." She paused. "I also know things about Thomas Caldwell that aren't in your boxes." Amelia went still. "What things?" "Where's Ethan?" "East pasture." "Go get him," Rebecca said. She leaned forward. "What I have needs to be said to both of you at the same time. I don't want to say it twice, and I don't want it filtered." Amelia looked at her for a moment. Rebecca Blackridge looked back with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who was used to being underestimated and had stopped caring about it. "Emma," Amelia said, "put the pots back and go find Lily." Emma surveyed her pot arrangement with the expression of someone being asked to dismantle serious work. Then she began putting them back, one by one, starting with the largest, which was technically correct. Amelia went to find Ethan. He came in with mud on his boots and the look of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something that needed finishing, and then he saw Rebecca at the kitchen table and the look changed into something that was complicated and warm and slightly exasperated, which appeared to be the native emotional register of their sibling relationship. "You could have sent word," he said. "I did send word. I sent it to Harold." Rebecca stood, and they embraced briefly, practically, the way people embrace who know each other well enough to skip the performance. "Sit down, both of you." They sat. Rebecca opened the bag she'd been carrying and produced a folder of papers, not a tin box, a proper legal folder with a cord tie, from a firm whose name was printed on the outside. "2 months ago," she said, "a man came into the title office in Billings. He was trying to register a transfer of property in Clearwater County, specifically a parcel on the eastern boundary of the Black Ridge land." She looked at Ethan. "He had documentation, transfer papers, surveyor certification, the whole package. The problem was that the property wasn't his to transfer. It was yours." Ethan said nothing. The muscle in his jaw moved. He claimed the transfer was the result of a debt settlement, that Black Ridge Ranch owed a sum to a contractor and had signed over the parcel as payment. He had a signed document. It looked legitimate at a glance. She opened the folder. "It wasn't. The signature was close, but it wasn't yours. I'd seen your signature on ranch documents in the company records from 4 years back when your father was doing a title search. It was wrong in 3 places, small places, but wrong." "Someone forged my signature," Ethan said. "Yes. I refused to process the transfer and flagged it for review. The man left and didn't come back." She placed a document on the table. "I kept the file, and I started looking into the name on the transfer papers." She tapped the document. "The contractor listed as the debt holder is a shell operation. It exists on paper. Registered in Wyoming, minimal activity, no physical address that checks out. But when you trace the ownership structure back through the layers," she looked at them both, "it comes back to Thomas Caldwell." The kitchen was very quiet. Amelia reached across and picked up the document. She read it carefully. She turned to the second page and the third. Her mind was already running the connections. The shell company, the forged signature, the parcel being the eastern boundary land that Thomas had been trying to acquire for years. The ordinance complaint and the public meeting had been pressure. This had been the contingency plan. If the pressure didn't work, the forgery would run alongside it, and by the time Ethan discovered the transfer had been attempted, it might already have proceeded somewhere that had less careful eyes than Rebecca Blackridge. "He was doing it in parallel," Amelia said. "The meeting, the complaint, those were to keep attention focused on the front. This was happening from the side." "Yes, Rebecca said. "That's my read." "Can you testify to what you saw? The discrepancies in the signature, the refusal to process, the man who brought it in?" "That's why I'm here," Rebecca said simply. Amelia set the document down. She looked at Ethan. He was sitting very still with the expression she recognized as the one that was anger held in a vice, controlled because losing control of it would cost something he wasn't willing to pay. "The man who brought it in," he said. "Do you have a description?" "Better. He signed the submission log, required by office policy." She turned to the back of the folder and produced a receipt form. "Samuel Greer, Caldwell's ranch foreman." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Sam Greer's been with Thomas for 8 years. He's also the one who will be named in the forgery complaint," Rebecca said, "which creates a problem for Thomas because Greer will need to decide whether to take the full weight of it himself or give Thomas up to reduce his own exposure." She looked at them both. When people start calculating their own liability, the stories they tell become very accurate very quickly. Amelia was already thinking about what order things needed to happen in. Foss needed to know about the forgery attempt before anything else moved. The counterfiling at the Territorial Land Office now had a second tier, not just the survey letter and the pattern of coercion, but an attempted property fraud with a documented paper trail and a witness who worked in title law. These were not the same weight of accusation. Property fraud was criminal. It went to a different kind of authority. "How long can you stay?" she asked Rebecca. Rebecca looked at her. "As long as it takes." She paused. Harold said you were thorough. He didn't say you were fast. I'm both, Amelia said. I just needed the right pieces. Rebecca held her gaze for a moment, and something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. Good, she said. She wrote to Foss that night with everything. The forgery, the shell company, the submission log, Rebecca's availability as a witness. She wrote it in 4 pages, clear and organized, the way she wrote everything now, because clarity was the tool that cut through the kind of complication Thomas Caldwell specialized in creating. Ethan came downstairs after she'd finished. She heard him in the kitchen and came out and found him standing by the window with a cup of coffee that was probably going cold, looking at the dark. She shouldn't have had to come, he said. She wanted to come. It's not... He stopped. He turned the cup in his hands. I've been fighting this alone because I thought that's what you did. You protect the people around you by keeping them out of it. That's one way to think about it, she said carefully. What's the other way? That the people who care about you have a right to choose whether they're in it or not. You didn't ask Rebecca to come. She came because she found something that affected you, and she decided it was her business too. She looked at him. You can't manage people's choices by removing them from the situation. They make their own choices. He was quiet. Then, like you did. I didn't choose your fight, she said. I chose to look at what was in the boxes. Then the boxes turned out to contain your fight, and by that point, she paused, because the honesty required in the next part was the kind that had weight. By that point, I was already here, and here had become something I wasn't willing to walk away from. He looked at her, not the recalibrating look, not the confirming look, something more direct than either of those. Amelia, he said. Don't, she said quietly. Not right now. There's too much in front of us, and I need to be clear-headed for all of it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. He drank the cold coffee without making a face and set the cup in the basin and said, Get some sleep. Foss will need us both. She went back to the table and sealed the letter and set it with the morning mail, and she sat alone in the kitchen for a while after that, not working, just sitting, which was something she almost never did. Thomas Caldwell learned about Rebecca's arrival within 2 days. She didn't know how. The speed of information in a small valley was its own kind of current, running underground and surfacing where you least expected. But she knew he'd learned it because of what happened next. Jeb Hutchins came to the Blackridge Gate on a Saturday morning. He came alone, without his wife, which meant this was business rather than social, and he had the look of a man who was delivering a message he hadn't written himself. Amelia was the one who went to the gate. Ethan was in the south field and Rebecca was reviewing the forgery documents inside, and it was Amelia alone at the fence with Jeb Hutchins, who sat on his horse and looked at her with the expression of someone trying to seem casual about something that was not casual. Mrs. Whitaker, he said. Mr. Hutchins. I've been asked to relay a message. He said it with the awkward precision of a man repeating words he'd memorized. Mr. Caldwell wants you to know that pursuing this further will cause damage that can't be undone. Not to him, to you. He paused. He specifically mentioned your daughters. She felt it, the cold current of it. She kept her face completely still. He mentioned my daughters how? She said. Her voice was even. Hutchins looked uncomfortable. He said the valley has long memories. The children grow up in communities, and communities remember things. He said, Hutchins stopped, and something in his expression shifted, like he was hearing the words again as he was saying them, and they were landing differently than they had when he'd agreed to carry them. He said it would be a shame if your girls grew up somewhere they'd never be fully accepted. She stood at the fence and looked at Jeb Hutchins, and she thought about what kind of man makes threats against 6-year-olds through intermediaries, and she thought about what kind of man carries those threats, and she thought very carefully about what to say. Mr. Hutchins, she said, I want you to think about what you just said to me, not what you were asked to say, what you actually said, to a mother, about her children. She let that sit for exactly 1 breath. And then I want you to think about whether that's the kind of errand you want to be known for running. Hutchins sat with it. The horse shifted under him. "I have 2 daughters," she continued. "They are the reason I came to Montana and the reason I'm still here and the reason I will not be moved by any threat that uses them as leverage, because any man who threatens children has already told me everything I need to know about his position." She met Hutchins' eyes. "Please tell Mr. Caldwell that I received his message and that my answer is the same as it has been every time he's asked, no." Hutchins looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly something that wasn't part of the message he'd been sent to deliver. "My wife doesn't know I'm here. She wouldn't have let me come." "Your wife," Amelia said, "sounds like a sensible woman." He turned his horse and rode away, and he didn't look back, and Amelia stood at the gate until he was out of sight, and then she went inside and wrote down every word of the exchange, signed and dated it, and added it to the box. Then she sat down and let her hands shake for about 30 seconds, because they were going to do it regardless, and she preferred to let them do it in private. Rebecca found the second document on a Tuesday, going through a set of correspondence that Amelia had flagged but not yet fully processed. It was a letter from 7 years ago between Thomas Caldwell and the merchant who held 2 of the Blackridge supply contracts, the ones Amelia had identified as having shifted in price over 18 months. The letter was not explicit. Thomas was careful, and he'd been careful in writing too, but it referenced an arrangement regarding the Blackridge account in language that was ambiguous if you read it alone and unambiguous if you read it alongside the account records Amelia had assembled. "He's careful," Rebecca said, holding the letter up. "He's been careful for 20 years, Amelia said. Careful enough that each piece of it looks like coincidence until you put it next to everything else." She looked at the letter. "What does it do for us?" "It corroborates the pattern. The forgery is the criminal piece. That stands on its own. But this," Rebecca set it down, "this is the civil piece. This shows it wasn't one bad act. It shows methodology." She looked at Amelia. "Juries like methodology. It makes the story make sense." "Are we going to a jury?" "Voss thinks so. He wrote yesterday. The Territorial Land Office has accepted the counterfiling and referred the forgery complaint to the Federal Marshal's office." She paused. "Samuel Greer was contacted 2 days ago." Amelia was quiet. She thought about Greer, a man who had carried a forged document into a title office, who had signed a log with his own name, who was now facing a federal charge and a calculation about whose side it was better to be on. "How long before he talks?" she said. "Voss says maybe a week, maybe less. Greer has a family." Rebecca folded her hands on the table. Men with families make faster calculations. It was true. Amelia had seen it in the numbers, in the documents, in every account of the people Thomas had pressured over the years. He chose targets carefully, people with something to protect, because people with something to protect were manageable. They could be leveraged. What he hadn't calculated, Amelia thought, was that the same thing that made people manageable also made them, at a certain point, immovable. You could only push someone so far toward the edge of losing what they loved before they turned around and pushed back with everything they had. She had been thinking about this in relation to herself. She was aware of that. Walter Pruitt came to the ranch on a Wednesday with Marco Garza, which was not something Amelia had arranged. They had apparently arranged it themselves, which was its own kind of signal. Ethan brought them into the kitchen, and Amelia made coffee, and Rebecca sat at the end of the table with the legal folder, and Pruitt, who was 63 and had the weathered certainty of a man who had been working land for 40 years and had very little patience left for dishonesty, said, "We heard about the forgery. Word travels." "Yes," Ethan said. "Greer signed the submission log himself." Pruitt shook his head with the particular disgust of someone who has seen a lot of stupidity in his years and can still be freshly surprised by it. "The man signed his own name." "He thought the transfer would process normally," Rebecca said. "He wasn't expecting anyone to look at the signature twice. Most clerks don't." Marco Garza, who had been quiet, said, "The survey letter, I've been thinking about it since the meeting." He looked at Amelia. "If the original survey was wrong, and Caldwell's family knew it was wrong, then the water dispute I lost 2 years ago was based on a precedent from a fraudulent survey," Amelia said. "Yes. That's being addressed in the counterfiling. Harold Foss has your case number. If the land office rules in favor of the Blackridge claim, It creates grounds for revisiting disputes that relied on the same flawed precedent. Garza absorbed this. He looked at his hands. 2 years, he said. I lost 2 years of water access because of a lie that started before I was born. Nobody said anything for a moment. What do you need from us? Pruitt said. He said it to Amelia, not to Ethan, which she noticed and did not comment on. Written accounts of your disputes with Caldwell. Dates, amounts, what was said, what was decided, anything you kept, correspondence, receipts, records of decisions. The more documentation, the clearer the pattern. She looked at both of them. And I want you to know what you're agreeing to. This is going to a federal level. It will take time. Thomas Caldwell will not make it easy, and his approach so far has been to make things personally uncomfortable for anyone who stands against him. She paused. You both have families and operations to protect. I'm not going to minimize what this might cost you. Pruitt looked at her steadily. Mrs. Whitaker, I've been watching Thomas Caldwell take from people in this valley for 15 years. First chance I've ever seen to do something that isn't just enduring it. He picked up his coffee. Tell me where to sign. Garza nodded. He was slower about it. He was a man who had been hurt before by hoping. But he nodded. She spent the rest of the morning taking their accounts, writing them out in full, having each man review and sign his own statement. Rebecca helped, catching details that needed clarifying, asking the follow-up questions that Amelia's notes flagged, but that she was in the middle of something else to ask herself. They worked well together, she and Rebecca. Amelia's organized precision and Rebecca's legal instinct fitting together without friction, which was not something Amelia had expected and was quietly grateful for. Ethan fed everyone at noon, something with beans and salt pork that was competent rather than inspired, but that was hot, and there was enough of it, which were the only qualities that mattered. Emma conducted a detailed interrogation of Walter Pruitt about his horses, which he submitted to with more patience than Amelia had expected from a man of his general demeanor. Lily sat beside Amelia and listened to everything without asking to be included, which was its own kind of inclusion. After Pruitt and Garza left, Rebecca sat back in her chair and looked at the stack of signed statements and said, That's 7 ranchers now, counting the 2 who sent letters after the meeting. 8, Amelia said. The Hendersons sent a note this morning. I haven't shown it to anyone yet. Rebecca looked at her. You're keeping count. I'm always keeping count. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a different register than she'd been using all day, less the colleague, more the sister of someone. He talks about you. Amelia kept her eyes on the statements she was organizing. Does he? Not the way men usually talk. He doesn't. Rebecca paused, choosing words with care. He says factual things. He says you found the survey letter. He says you handled the town meeting. He says you went to Foss before he thought to. She paused again. But the way he says them. Rebecca, I'm just telling you what I observe. I observe things. It's how I work. I know, Amelia said. I also observe things. That's how I work. She picked up the stack of statements and tapped them even on the table. And right now what I observe is that we have 8 signed accounts, a forgery referral at the federal level, a counterfiling at the Territorial Land Office, a shell company that traces back to Thomas Caldwell, and a foreman who is going to run a calculation about his family in the next few days and arrive at an answer that is not in Thomas Caldwell's favor. She set the statements down. That's what I'm focused on. Rebecca looked at her for a long moment. You're the most careful person I've ever met, she said. It wasn't quite a compliment, and it wasn't quite a criticism. It was an observation, delivered with the precision Rebecca Blackridge applied to everything she saw. I've had reasons to be, Amelia said. Samuel Greer's statement came through Foss on a Friday, 6 days after he'd been contacted. It was 11 pages. It named Thomas Caldwell directly and explicitly as the architect of the forgery scheme. It described not 1 attempted transfer, but 3, 2 of which had been completed through county-level filings that had passed through Webb's office without scrutiny. It named the shell company and identified 2 more, related entities. It described conversations in which Thomas had explicitly directed Greer to manage the document fraud, including specific instructions about which signatures to copy and how to move the paperwork through which channels to avoid triggering review. It also described something that none of them had known. Thomas Caldwell had been doing this in other counties, not just Clearwater. There were 2 land seizures in the next county east that bore the same structural fingerprint, the same shell company pattern, the same manufactured debt documentation, the same timing around legal pressure campaigns. Greer had personally handled documentation for one of them. Foss's accompanying letter was the longest he'd sent. It said that the federal marshal's office was now treating this as a multi-county fraud operation, that Thomas Caldwell would be served with a formal complaint within the week, that Commissioner Webb was being investigated separately for his role in facilitating the ordinance complaint, that the counter-filing at the Territorial Land Office had been elevated to priority status. He also said, at the bottom, in what was for Harold Foss almost warmth, the work that was done with the documents made this possible. I've handled cases where we knew something was wrong for years and couldn't prove it. This is what proof looks like when someone builds it correctly. She read that line twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in the box. Ethan had read it first. She'd handed it to him across the table when it arrived, because it was his ranch and his name and 20 years of his family's history. And when he finished, he set it down and sat there for a moment with something on his face that she couldn't quite read. Not relief exactly, something more complicated. The expression of a man who had been holding a weight for so long that when someone helped lift it, the relief was entangled with the strangeness of the absence. Rebecca poured coffee without being asked and set it in front of both of them, and took her own cup to the window, giving them a moment that she had apparently decided they needed. Ethan looked at Amelia. "It's over," he said. "Not yet," she said, carefully, because she didn't want to take anything from him. "But it will be." He nodded. He picked up the coffee and held it and let it go cold, which was what he always did. And for some reason, that ordinary thing, that completely predictable failure to drink a cup of coffee while it was hot, made something in her chest do something she was not going to examine right now. "Whatever happens next," he said. "What you did? We did it," she said. "Amelia. Ethan." She said his name back at him with the same weight he'd given hers, which stopped him. "When I arrived here, I had $14.32 and 2 daughters and no plan. You gave me a table and a box of records and a fair arrangement. Everything that came out of that was both of us." She looked at him. "Don't make me into something I'm not. I'm not a rescuer. I'm someone who reads carefully and works hard and happened to be in the right place with the right documents." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're more than that," he said. She said nothing. Rebecca at the window was very carefully looking at something outside that may or may not have been interesting. The kitchen held all of it. The letter in the tin box, the 8 signed statements, the cold coffee, the curtains in the window that a dead woman had hung and that Amelia had put back because they belonged there. The sound of Emma explaining something to Lily upstairs with great urgency. The October light coming through the clean glass. There was still work to do. There would be a hearing and testimony, and Thomas Caldwell would hire the best lawyer his diminishing resources could afford, and he would not go quietly. There were 2 other counties to consider and a commissioner to investigate, and the long administrative tale of a fraud case that would take months to fully resolve. But the shape of it had changed. The thing that had been pressing down on the Blackridge Ranch for 3 years, that had been pressing down on the whole valley, on people who hadn't known they were all being pressed by the same hand, had been named now and documented and was in the hands of people with the authority to act on it. Thomas Caldwell had built his power on the assumption that the people he targeted had nothing to fight him with, that poverty meant powerlessness, that a woman with 2 children and a cracked boot and no connections was a problem that solved itself. He had been wrong about what powerlessness looked like. He had been wrong about what a careful woman with a tin box could build from a misfiled letter and 20 years of records that nobody had thought to read. Outside, the October sky had gone to the particular clear, cold blue that came before the first frost, and the valley lay out under it in the long, quiet way of things that had endured. And the Blackridge Ranch stood in the middle of it, looking exactly like what it was, a piece of land that had been fought for honestly and would not be surrendered. And inside the kitchen, the coffee went cold, and the curtains moved in the draft from the window, and the tin box sat closed on the table with everything in it that had been needed, found by someone who had arrived with nothing and had simply refused to leave it that way. The federal marshal arrived in Clearwater on a Monday morning in the first week of November, when the frost had finally committed and the valley lay under a sky the color of old pewter. His name was Carver. He was a quiet man in his 40s with the economy of movement that came from spending years managing situations that could go wrong in multiple directions at once. And he came with 2 deputies and a document folio that contained the formal complaint against Thomas Caldwell, Samuel Greer, and 3 associated parties whose names appeared in Greer's 11-page statement. He did not make a production of the arrival. He went directly to the Caldwell property with his deputies and served the papers there, and the whole thing was done before noon. Amelia heard about it from Ruth Alderman, who heard about it from the man who delivered Thomas Caldwell's mail, who had been at the property when the marshal arrived, and who described Thomas's face upon receiving the papers as the specific expression of a man watching something he built come apart at the foundation. She received this information in the general store on a Tuesday morning, and she stood with it for a moment, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but with the particular quiet that comes when something you have worked toward for a long time finally becomes real in the world outside your own effort. "He didn't say anything?" she asked, "when he received them?" "According to what I heard, he went inside and closed the door," Ruth said. She was restocking the thread display with the methodical attention she gave to everything, which is more telling than anything he could have said. Amelia thought about Thomas Caldwell going inside and closing the door. She thought about the man who had stood on the station platform and looked at her cracked boot and her 2 daughters and decided in 4 seconds what she was worth. She thought about the letters in the tin box, her careful copies of everything she'd said honestly to a man who had not been honest in return. She had not written those letters naively. She'd written them as someone trying to do a hard thing correctly. The failure of the arrangement had not been a failure of her judgment so much as evidence that some people perform honesty without practicing it. She had stopped being angry about Thomas Caldwell some weeks back. Not forgiven. She wasn't built for that particular abstraction, and she didn't trust people who claimed to achieve it quickly. But the anger had burned down to something cooler and more useful, which was clarity. She saw him clearly now. Not as a villain in the way of stories, not as a monster, but as a specific kind of person. A man who had learned early that his family's power meant the rules applied to other people, and who had never been seriously challenged on that assumption until a woman with a tin box and nothing to lose had sat down and started reading. "What happens to him now?" Ruth asked. "There'll be a hearing, federal level. Boss says it could take several months. The land office findings come first, and those affect the criminal case." She picked up the thread she'd come in to buy. "He won't lose everything immediately. These things are slow. But he'll lose." She considered that. "He's already lost the thing that mattered most to him," she said. "He lost it the night Greer signed the submission log and put his own name on it." Ruth looked at her. "His control over the story." "Yes." Ruth nodded slowly. She had the expression of a woman who had been watching this valley for 19 years from behind her counter and had seen a great many stories resolve and a great many not resolve and could tell the difference between the 2. "You done all right?" she said. It was not the most elaborate praise Amelia had ever received, but coming from Ruth Alderman, it felt like something she could keep. The harder conversation happened that evening. She had been preparing for it in some corner of her mind for weeks, the way you prepare for something you know is coming but can't quite bring yourself to schedule, going over the words, the order of them, the things that needed to be said, and the things that didn't. She had gotten good at building cases. She was less practiced at this. The girls were in bed. Rebecca had gone to the sitting room with one of the books she'd brought from Billings. Ethan was at the table with the accounts, the real accounts now, the one she'd reorganized from the beginning, which showed a ranch that was in real, if repairable condition, with specific problems that had specific solutions instead of the vague, encroaching trouble they'd had before. She sat down across from him. He looked up. "The marshal served the papers today," she said. "I know. Webb came to see me." He set the pen down. Commissioner Webb had been doing a great deal of coming to see people since the federal investigation had named him as a person of interest in the facilitation complaint. He had the look these days of a man permanently braced for impact. He wanted to make sure I knew he'd had no real knowledge of the forgery. "Did you believe him?" Ethan considered this with the honesty he applied to everything. He's too stupid for a scheme that complicated, he said finally. Caldwell used him because he was easy to use, not because he was a partner. Webb genuinely thought the ordnance complaint was legitimate. He just didn't ask hard enough questions about who was pushing it. He paused. That's its own kind of failure, but it's a different one. Foss will sort out what it means legally. Yes. He looked at her. He had the expression that she recognized as the one preceding something he'd decided to say. Amelia. I know, she said. I haven't said it. You're going to ask me to stay. He was quiet for a moment. Is that wrong? No, she said. It's not wrong. She looked at the table, but at the accounts between them, at the pen he'd set down, at the ordinary objects of the life they'd been building alongside each other for 2 months, without either of them naming what they were building. I need to tell you something first, something true. All right. I came to Montana because I had run out of other options, she said. I want you to know that clearly, because I have spent my life being a careful woman, and careful women are honest about their starting points. I answered Thomas Caldwell's advertisement because I needed a home for my daughters, and I couldn't make one alone in the city on what I had left. That was the truth of it. Not romance, not adventure. Necessity. She looked at him. And I want you to know that because what came after, what happened here, what I feel about this place and about you, I don't want any of it confused with desperation. I don't want you to think I'm staying because I have to. He held her gaze. I know why you're staying, he said. Do you? You stayed when you had options, he said. Caldwell offered you money. You could have taken it and gone somewhere else and started again. You had the Miller work and the doctor's work and enough to build on. You stayed because, he paused, careful with the words, because something here was worth staying for. And it wasn't just the documents. She said nothing for a moment. The fire was burning low and the kitchen was warm and the curtains were still at the dark window, and somewhere upstairs she could hear Emma breathing in the deep, committed way Emma slept, as though sleep were a competition she intended to win. I haven't let myself want something in 2 years, she said. Not really. I wanted safety for the girls. I wanted stability. Those are needs dressed up as wants. They're not the same thing. A real want is something you could technically survive without. A real want is something you choose. She looked at him. I'm choosing. Ethan Blackridge did not say anything romantic. He was not a man built for romantic speeches, and she would not have trusted one if he'd delivered it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers on the account ledger. Warm, calloused, steady. And he said, I know. I've known for a while. How long? She asked, because she wanted to know. The night you found the survey letter, he said. The way you looked at it. Not excited, just settled. Like you'd found something that confirmed what you already suspected about the world. That there's always a record somewhere if you're willing to look. He paused. That's when I knew you were someone I didn't want to lose. She turned her hand over under his. I'm not easy, she said. I need you to know that too. I have opinions about accounts, and I'll tell you when you're wrong, and I keep records of everything, which some people find uncomfortable. And I have 2 daughters who are going to be people in their own right, not accessories to a household, and anyone who is part of our life will need to understand that. Emma reorganized my tool shed last week, he said. I know. I'm sorry. She organized it better than I had it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Lily taught herself the hay inventory without being asked and found a discrepancy I'd missed for 6 months. He looked at her. I know who your daughters are, Amelia. I've known them for 2 months. They're not something I'm tolerating. He stopped, and when he started again, his voice was quieter. They're a part of this now. A part of what this place is. She thought about what Lily had said weeks ago. He fixed Emma's boot and didn't make a thing of it. She thought about the cake on Lily's birthday. Biscuit dough and dried fruit, and the complete absence of ceremony, just a thing that needed to happen, and so he made it happen. She thought about Emma asleep on the barn floor with the cat, and Ethan carrying firewood out from under her sleeping arm. All right, she said. All right? Yes. She was not a woman who said things twice for emphasis. Once, clearly, was sufficient. He looked at her across the table with the expression that was not quite the almost smile she'd catalogued months ago, but was something past it, something more open, less guarded, the face of a man who had lived with his defenses up for long enough that lowering them was a physical effort and he was making it. "I'll talk to Foss," he said, "about what the legal arrangement should look like." "I already wrote him," she said. "Last week." He stared at her. "I told you I've been preparing for this conversation," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh properly. Not the almost sound she'd caught a few times, but the real thing, surprised out of him. And it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less like a man who had been managing difficulty alone for 3 years. It lasted only a moment, and then it settled back into something quieter. But it had been there, and she had seen it. "You are the most organized person I have ever met," he said. "I prefer thorough," she said. "Organized implies I have a system. I just pay attention." Rebecca left on a Thursday, 2 weeks later, once the federal hearing date had been set and her formal statement had been filed and there was nothing more her presence could accomplish that correspondence couldn't handle. She stood in the yard with her trunk and the same practical efficiency she'd arrived with, and she embraced Ethan briefly and then turned to Amelia. "You'll write," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Amelia said. Rebecca looked at her for a moment with the assessing directness she applied to everything. "He's been alone for 3 years," she said quietly. "Not just since Margaret died. Before that, too, in his way. He's not good at needing people. You'll have to be patient with that." "I know," Amelia said. "I'm not good at being needed. He'll have to be patient with that." Rebecca's mouth curved. "You'll suit each other then." She picked up her bag. "The forgery hearing is in February. I'll come back for it." "We'll be here," Amelia said. She watched the wagon take Rebecca down the road and out of sight, and she stood in the yard for a moment in the November cold with her own thoughts, which were complicated and real and not entirely resolved, because that was the nature of actual things, that they didn't resolve entirely, they just became something you carried more comfortably. Emma appeared at her elbow. "Is she coming back? In February?" "Good." Emma watched the road with the proprietary air she had adopted toward anyone who was now part of her world. "She taught me how to do the correspondence filing." "I know. I saw." "I filed it better than she showed me." "I believe you," Amelia said. The federal hearing took place in February as scheduled, in a courthouse in the county seat, and it lasted 4 days. Thomas Caldwell arrived with a lawyer from Helena who was expensive and proficient and who did everything a good lawyer could do with the available facts, which was not enough. The facts were documented too completely for creative interpretation. The survey letter established the fraudulent foundation. Greer's statement described the methodology. The 8 signed accounts from Valley ranchers demonstrated the pattern. Rebecca's testimony about the attempted transfer and the signature discrepancy was precise and unshakable. Amelia's organized documentation, which Harold Foss presented as what he called the most thoroughly prepared evidentiary record he'd worked with in 30 years of practice, left the hearing officer very little to deliberate about. Thomas Caldwell was found liable on 4 counts of land fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. The criminal verdict, which required a higher standard, came 2 months later and was narrower, covering the forgery and the related conspiracy. But it was enough to result in substantial fines and a period of supervised conditions on any future land dealings in the territory. Effectively, he was finished as the kind of operator he had been. Commissioner Webb was removed from his position and fined for negligence in office. He was not a dishonest man exactly, only an incurious one, and the distinction made a legal difference, though not necessarily a moral one. The land office ruling restored the water rights to their accurate recorded position, which benefited the Blackridge Ranch directly, and established a precedent that Harold Foss immediately used to file for review of 2 of Marco Garza's losses. Those reviews were granted. Walter Pruitt's supply contracts were renegotiated with a formal record of the original manipulation attached, which meant the merchants involved settled quickly and quietly. None of this happened smoothly. There were delays and counterfilings, and 1 week in January when Foss wrote to say that Thomas's lawyer had found a procedural argument that might require a supplemental hearing, and Amelia spent 2 days going back through the documents looking for anything she might have missed. pulling Ethan and Rebecca and eventually even Lily into the review before Foss's follow-up letter arrived, saying the argument had been dismissed. The work was not dramatic. It was slow and it was detailed, and it required sustained attention across months when the immediate crisis had passed, and the more ordinary pressures of running a ranch and raising children and building a life occupied most of the available hours. That was the truth of it that no one usually told. The resolution of things like this was not a moment, but a long trailing process, and you had to care enough to stay with it past the point where it felt urgent. She cared enough. They married in April, when the mud had dried enough to make the yard presentable, and the first green was coming up in the garden Amelia had expanded in March to 3 times its original size. It was a practical ceremony. The justice of the peace came from Millhaven. Foss had recommended him, which meant he was competent and unlikely to be theatrical about it. And the guests were Ruth Alderman and her husband, Doc Hennessy, Walter Pruitt, Marco Garza and his wife, and Rebecca, who had come back for February and simply not left, which was beginning to suggest that her reasons for staying had something to do with Harold Foss, though no one had said this aloud. Lily wore the dress Amelia had been saving, the good one, packed for the meeting with Thomas Caldwell that had never been a meeting, that had been a dismissal. She had remade it slightly, taken in the waist, added a collar, turned it into something that fit a woman who was no longer the woman who had packed it. She wore it and it was fine, and she did not think about the last time she had expected to wear it, because that was then and this was now. And the distance between them was exactly what work and time and refusing to leave could build. Emma was the flower girl. She had approached this responsibility with the organizational seriousness she brought to everything, had insisted on arranging the wildflowers herself, and had assembled a bouquet that was structurally ambitious, if not entirely conventional. She carried it with both hands and an expression of profound official gravity. Lily stood beside Amelia. She did not cry. She was 7 now, and she had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and the composed certainty of a child who had moved through enough uncertainty to know what steadiness felt like when she found it. She held her mother's hand until the moment Amelia needed both hands for the ring, and then she let go without being asked, because she was Lily, and she always knew when to hold on and when to release. Ethan was not comfortable with ceremony. She had known that. He stood through it with the contained patience of a man who understood that some things required a formal moment and was willing to give it one, though he would be relieved when it was done and they could go back to the ordinary texture of the day. She loved that about him, the way he did difficult things without making them into a performance of his own difficulty. She had spent enough time around people who needed credit for enduring things that she knew what it looked like when someone just endured them. He said the words clearly, and he meant them. She could tell the difference between words a person meant and words a person was producing. She had always been able to tell. And when it was done, he looked at her with the expression that was not quite the almost smile anymore, that had been something else for months now, something more settled and more complicated and more real. "Well," he said. "Well," she said back. Ruth Alderman laughed from the small crowd at the fence. What she understood, by the time the apple trees they planted that spring were tall enough to need staking, was something she hadn't known how to name when she arrived in Clearwater with a cracked boot and $14.32 and 2 daughters whose futures she was solely responsible for. She had believed, coming west, that what she needed was an arrangement, a practical structure that would take care of the basic requirements, shelter, stability, someone to share the work, and that love, if it existed at all in the life of a practical widow in her 30s with no resources and 2 children, would be a secondary consideration at best, a luxury she couldn't afford. What she had found instead was that the arrangement and the love were not separate things. They had built from the same material, the same daily decisions, the same honest accounting, the same willingness to stay in a difficult room and keep working when leaving would have been easier. She had not fallen into the life she had now. She had constructed it, the way you construct anything worth having, carefully, with attention to what was real, with the willingness to be wrong sometimes and right sometimes, and to keep going regardless. James had taught her that paper remembered what people forgot, but what she had learned, what Clearwater had taught her, at the cost of a public humiliation and a storm and 20 years of someone else's misfiled documents, was that paper was only the record of what people had actually done. The thing that mattered was the doing, the daily accumulation of small decisions that added up, over time to a life. Thomas Caldwell had not been undone by any single dramatic failure. He had been undone by the accumulated record of who he had been in thousands of small moments across 20 years. The survey, the supplier pressures, the shell companies, the forged signature, each of them was a small thing, separately. Together, they were a portrait. You could build a portrait in either direction. That was the thing she wanted her daughters to understand, the thing she found herself believing more completely with each year that passed. The choices that mattered were not usually the dramatic ones. They were the everyday ones. How you handled what you were given when nobody was watching. Whether you were honest when honesty cost you something. Whether you stayed when staying was harder than leaving. She had stayed. Ethan had given her a table and a box of records, and she had stayed, and the staying had built something that neither of them could have built alone. Emma, at 9, had taken over the poultry operation entirely and was lobbying for expansion into the neighboring property's unused eastern corner, which now belonged properly and legally to the Blackridge Ranch after the land office ruling. She had submitted a written proposal, 4 pages with projected income figures, to both Amelia and Ethan, which Amelia had read with the particular feeling of watching someone become themselves in real time. Lily, at 10, had started helping Harold Foss with correspondence on the days she went to town with Amelia. She sat at the edge of the office and read everything she was allowed to read and asked questions with the careful precision of someone who was learning a system from the inside out. Foss, who was not a man who wasted words on children, had said to Amelia that Lily had an instinct for documentary evidence that he had not seen in most adults. Amelia had said, "I know." She had known since the day Lily was born, if she was honest about it. Ethan was at the fence when she came out to the yard one evening in the 3rd summer, watching the light go off the mountains the way the light did in Montana in July, long and gold and unhurried, like it had all the time in the world. He had his hat in his hand, which meant he'd just come in from somewhere, and he was looking at the mountains with the settled private expression of a man who was at home in a way that went past the physical. She came and stood beside him. He put his arm around her without looking away from the mountains. She let herself lean against him slightly, which was a thing she had gotten better at, allowing the leaning, not being the one who always stood alone on her own balance. "Pruitt came by," he said. "His east water flow is up for the first time since the rerouting was corrected." "I know. He sent a note." "Of course he sent a note." "He should document it," she said, "for the record." He looked at her. The not-quite smile, fully itself now, comfortable in his face the way things got comfortable when they'd been used enough. "For the record," he said. "There's always a record," she said. "You might as well make sure it says what's true." The mountains held their light for a while longer. The ranch sat around them in the July evening, the sound of the horses in the near paddock, the chickens conducting whatever business chickens conducted at this hour under Emma's governance, the faint sound of Lily inside at the table where she was reading something Foss had lent her. The things that had been broken were not entirely mended. That was not how broken things worked, and she was too honest a woman to pretend otherwise. There were still moments when the weight of what it had cost came back to her, when she thought about the platform at Clearwater Station and the way Thomas Caldwell's face had gone cold, and felt the ghost of what that had been. There were still nights when she thought about James and the rail yard and the things she couldn't have a receipt for. She did not expect these things to disappear. She had stopped wanting them to. They were part of the record too. But the record was longer now, and the most recent pages were the ones that counted. She was a woman who had arrived with nothing and had built something true. That was not a small thing. That was not something Thomas Caldwell's assessment of her cracked boot and her 2 daughters had been able to prevent. He had looked at her on a station platform and seen a liability, and he had been wrong in the specific way of people who mistake poverty for character, who confuse what a person has with what a person is. She was not what she had arrived with. Nobody was. She was what she had done since. And the record of that, finally, was exactly what she would want it to be.